Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into one of history's strangest obsessions. Imagine living in a world where being 1 minute late to dinner could destroy your reputation forever, where your city's clocks might show a completely different time than the town just 10 miles away, where missing a train didn't just mean inconvenience, it meant you were morally defective, unreliable, possibly even dishonest. This was Victorian Britain, where time itself became a weapon of judgment, and every single minute of your day was scrutinized like evidence in a courtroom. What you're about to discover tonight will make you grateful you weren't born in the 1800s, and maybe, just maybe, it'll make you look at your own relationship with time in a completely new way. So before we step into this peculiar world together, I want to ask you something. If you find yourself enjoying this strange journey through history, would you take just a moment to subscribe to the channel and leave a like? But only if you genuinely connect with what we're exploring tonight. I'm curious, where are you right now as you're listening to this? Are you tucked in bed with the lights dimmed low, sitting by a window watching the rain? Maybe you're on a long drive through the night. Drop a comment and let me know. I love hearing about the moments when these stories find you. Now, get comfortable, adjust your pillows, let the world outside fade away. Tonight we're travelling back to a time when the ticking of a clock wasn't just a sound, it was a moral judgment. Picture this, it's 1839 in England and you're standing on a railway platform in Bristol. You glance up at the station clock, it reads 2:15 in the afternoon. You're right on time for your train to London. But here's where things get strange. A traveller standing next to you pulls out his pocket watch, frowns and insists it's only 2:05. Another passenger checks her timepiece and announces confidently that it's 2:22. None of you are wrong. You're all looking at different times because in 1839, there was no such thing as a standardized time across Britain. Every town, every city, every village kept its own local time based on the position of the sun in their particular sky. This might sound charmingly quaint, like something from a fairy tale. But imagine the chaos. Railway companies were trying to run trains across the country on precise schedules, but each station along the route operated on a different time. The confusion wasn't just inconvenient, it was deadly. Trains crashed because drivers thought they had the right of way, only to discover that the other train was running on a different time altogether. It was like trying to conduct an orchestra where every musician was playing from a different sheet of music. The Great Western Railway decided enough was enough. In November of 1840 they made a revolutionary announcement. Every single station on their line would abandon local time and switch to London time, just like that. It sounds simple, but this was earth-shattering. For the first time in human history, an entire network of communities agreed to ignore what the sun was telling them and trust a clock synchronized to a city hundreds of miles away. Think about what this really meant. For thousands of years, humans had organized their lives around the natural rhythms of daylight. When the sun was highest in the sky, that was noon. Simple, instinctive. But now a train company was saying, "No, we're going to tell you what time it is." And slowly, miraculously, frighteningly, everyone agreed. Within 15 years, by 1855, almost every public building in Britain had switched to what they called railway time. Town halls that had kept their own local time for centuries suddenly adjusted their clocks to match London. Churches did the same. It was as if the entire nation had collectively decided to abandon its own sense of time and adopt something new, something modern, something precise. But here's where it gets really interesting. Some towns weren't ready to let go. They mounted 2 sets of clock hands on their public clocks, one showing the traditional local time, one showing the new railway time. Imagine standing in a town square looking up at a clock tower and seeing 2 different minute hands pointing in 2 different directions. Which one do you trust? The time your ancestors used the time that matched the sun and the seasons, or this new mechanical time imposed by railways and progress and modernity. This wasn't just about telling time, this was about authority. For generations, the church bell had been the voice of time. The church told you when to wake, when to pray, when to work, when to rest. Time was spiritual, cyclical, connected to God and nature. But now time came from railway companies, from astronomical observatories, from engineers and scientists. The very soul of time was being ripped away from the divine and handed over to machines. The Victorians built enormous clocks at their railway stations, not just to tell time but to show power. St Pancras Station in London installed a clock so massive it could be seen from incredible distances. The diameter of this clock was 16 feet and 9 inches. To put that in perspective, that's taller than most rooms in your house. The minute hand alone was 7 feet and 3 inches long. This wasn't a timepiece. This was a monument, a declaration. We control time now. We decide what hour it is, respect our authority, and the fascinating thing, it worked. People started showing up at these enormous railway clocks to set their personal watches. The station became a temple of time, and the station master became a kind of priest adjusting the official clock based on telegraph signals sent directly from the Royal Observatory in Greenwich. Every day an electrical pulse would travel through telegraph wires from the observatory to stations across the country, and station masters would carefully, reverently adjust their clocks to match. It was like a daily ritual of synchronization, ensuring the entire nation was beating to the same temporal heartbeat. But some people resisted. I love this detail. In certain conservative towns, locals would deliberately keep their old time, refusing to acknowledge railway time. They saw it as an invasion, a loss of independence. These towns would have signs that read something like, "Local time is 8 minutes ahead of London time." Can you imagine the arguments? A husband saying, "We're going by railway time, that's the modern way," while his wife insists, "My mother's clock has kept this town's time for 40 years, and I'm not changing for some railway company in London." Children growing up in this era must have been so confused. "Mother, what time is it?" And the answer would depend on whether you were asking about real time or railway time, church time or station time. Time itself had become fragmented, multiple, contested. And then something remarkable happened. In October of 1884, representatives from 25 nations gathered in Washington, D.C. for the International Meridian Conference, their goal to divide the entire world into 24 time zones, all synchronized to the prime meridian running through Greenwich, England. The whole planet would now operate on a system invented because British trains needed to run on time. Think about that. A railway's need for punctuality ended up dictating how every human on Earth measures their day. This is when the modern concept of being on time was truly born. Before this, time was flexible, negotiable, personal. After this, time became rigid, standardized. And here's the crucial part, morally significant. Because the Victorians didn't just want everyone to use the same time, they wanted everyone to believe that using time correctly said something about your character, your worth, your very soul. Railway companies started printing schedules with an almost religious precision. Trains would depart at 2:43, not 2:45, and they meant it. If you showed up at 2:44, you'd watch your train pulling away. No exceptions, no sympathy. You had failed to manage your time, and that meant you had failed at life. I found this incredible quote from an American railway official named William Allen, who said, "Railroad trains are the great educators and monitors of the people in teaching and maintaining exact time." Educators, monitors. The trains weren't just transportation, they were moral instructors, teaching the masses how to be punctual, how to be disciplined, how to be modern. And here's something that still gives me chills. Allen claimed that if a city were cut off from all railroad and telegraph communication for just 1 month, and if all the clocks were secretly adjusted by 30 minutes, not one person in 1,000 would even notice. Because without the constant reinforcement from the railway, without those synchronized clocks at every station, people would drift back into their old flexible, natural sense of time. The railways had literally trained an entire civilization to depend on mechanical precision. This transformation happened so fast that many Victorians felt dizzy from it. One generation grew up in a world where being late was barely a concept. You showed up when you showed up. The next generation grew up in a world where being 2 minutes late to anything was a social catastrophe and a character defect. In the span of just 50 years from 1840 to 1890, Britain went from having hundreds of different local times to having one unified, standardized, morally charged concept of time. And it all started because trains needed to run on schedule. Isn't that wild? The way you experience every hour of your day, the anxiety you might feel about being late, the guilt when you waste time. All of it traces back to this moment when railways decided they needed everyone on the same clock. But inventing synchronized time was just the beginning, because once the Victorians had everyone using the same clock they needed to make sure everyone was using it properly, and that's where things got truly strange, truly rigid, and if we're being honest, truly hilarious. They didn't just want you to know what time it was. They wanted you to prove every single day that you were the kind of person who deserved to exist in modern society. And the way you proved that was through something that became absolutely sacred, absolutely non-negotiable, absolutely terrifying: punctuality. Perfect, precise, down to the second punctuality. And in our next part, we're going to explore how being exactly on time became more than a courtesy. It became a moral virtue that could determine your entire social standing, your business prospects, even your prospects for marriage. The Victorians believed they could read your soul by checking your pocket watch. And trust me, what they discovered about themselves in the process was far stranger than anything they imagined. So there you are, standing in your perfectly appointed Victorian drawing room. You've received an invitation to dinner at the home of someone important, perhaps a potential business partner, maybe the family of someone you're courting, or just a social connection that could change your life. The invitation specifies 7 o'clock. And here's where your heart starts racing, because in Victorian Britain that 7 o'clock isn't a suggestion, it's not approximate, it's not 7-ish or around 7, or 7-ish plus fashionably late. It means 7 o'clock exactly, not 7:01, not 6:59, 7 o'clock. And if you fail, well, there was a phrase the Victorians used that should tell you everything you need to know about how seriously they took this. Etiquette manuals of the era, thick books that people studied like sacred texts, stated quite plainly that it was better to not show up at all than to arrive late. Read that again in your mind. Better to completely abandon your host to simply not appear to send an apology note and stay home than to walk through that door at 7:03. Can you imagine you're getting ready, you're rushing, your carriage hits traffic, maybe there's a horse that's gone lame, maybe the streets are crowded, maybe it's raining and everything moves slower. You arrive at 7:05 and the consensus among polite society is that you should have just turned around and gone home, rather than inflict those 5 minutes of lateness upon your host and the other guests. Why? Because those 5 minutes weren't just 5 minutes. They were evidence. They were testimony. They were a window into your very soul. The Victorians had developed this elaborate philosophy that punctuality equaled honesty, which equaled trustworthiness, which equaled good character, which equaled moral worth. It was like a chain of logic that they believed in with religious fervour. If you couldn't manage to be on time, how could you manage money? How could you keep promises? How could you raise children? How could you be trusted in business? How could you possibly be a person of integrity? Let me share something from a fascinating academic dissertation I came across about the history of punctuality in Britain. The researcher traced how the word punctual originally referred to being exact in the payment of debts, paying exactly what you owed exactly when you owed it. So when someone said you were punctual, they meant you were financially honest. But during the Victorian era, this meaning expanded. Being on time became the same as paying your debts. Every social obligation was like a financial debt, and showing up at the exact moment promised was how you paid it back. This meant that tardiness wasn't just rude, it was theft. You were stealing time from other people. You were showing that you couldn't be trusted with something as basic as managing your own schedule. So how could you be trusted with actual money, actual responsibilities, actual moral choices? And Victorian society was absolutely brutal about enforcing this. There are records of business deals falling apart because someone arrived 15 minutes late to a meeting. Marriages were called off because a suitor showed up late to call on a young lady too many times. Friendships ended, reputations crumbled, all because of the clock. Here's what really gets me though. The Victorians developed this concept they called being exactly punctual. Not just punctual, exactly punctual. This phrase appears over and over in etiquette books and personal letters. Exactly punctual. It's almost obsessive, isn't it? As if just being on time wasn't enough. You had to be precisely mathematically perfectly on time. I want you to think about what this felt like in practical terms. You're that dinner guest we talked about. 7 o'clock invitation, you live 30 minutes away by carriage. Do you leave at 6:30? No, because what if traffic is light? What if the horses move faster than expected? What if you arrive at 6:55, then you're early? And being early was almost as bad as being late because it suggested you were over-eager, desperate for the connection lacking in social grace. So you have to calculate perfectly. You have to time your departure so that you arrive at exactly 7 o'clock. Not a minute before, not a minute after. Exactly. And this isn't the modern era with GPS and traffic apps. You're making this calculation based on gut feeling, experience and prayer. The stress must have been incredible. Victorian personal diaries are full of anxiety about punctuality. People wrote about lying awake the night before important engagements, worried about timing. They wrote about the relief they felt when they arrived exactly on time, as if they'd just passed some crucial test of their humanity. And if you were hosting, the pressure was even worse. Because not only did you have to be ready exactly on time, you had to ensure that everything in your home ran with clockwork precision. Your servants had to be coordinated to the minute. The food had to be timed perfectly. Remember that rule about hot food being smoking and cold food being cool as ice? That required split-second coordination in an era before refrigerators and reliable ovens. One etiquette manual from the 1870s advised that the time should be punctual. Simple statement, massive implications. It meant that if you said dinner would be served at 7:30, then at 7:30 exactly the first course should appear. Not 7:35, not 7:28, 7:30. And guests were expected to notice. They were judging you, evaluating you, determining your worth as a host, as a manager, as a person, based on whether that soup arrived at 7:30 or 7:32. But here's where it gets psychologically fascinating. This obsession with punctuality created what we might call a trust crisis in Victorian society. Because timekeeping devices in the early Victorian era were actually pretty unreliable. Your pocket watch might gain or lose several minutes a day. Different clocks showed different times. Even after railway time was standardized, individual timepieces were still imprecise. So how did you know if you were actually on time? You couldn't fully trust your own watch. You would have to constantly check it against public clocks, against other people's timepieces, against the church bells or the factory whistles. Every interaction became this little negotiation. What time do you have? I have 7:05. Interesting, I have 7:07. Well, which of us is right? I set mine by the station clock this morning. Ah, but I set mine by the Greenwich signal yesterday. The Victorians were literally negotiating reality every time they discussed what time it was. And yet, despite this fundamental uncertainty, they insisted on exact punctuality. It's kind of beautiful in its absurdity, isn't it? There was this middle-class anxiety running through all of this too. See, the aristocracy could be fashionably late. They had that privilege. If a duke showed up 30 minutes late to dinner, well, he was a duke. What were you going to do about it? But the rising middle class, merchants, professionals, managers, they didn't have that luxury. They had to prove they were respectable, reliable, worthy of their new status, and that they proved it through obsessive punctuality. The historian I mentioned earlier argued that punctuality became a distinctly middle-class value. It was promoted by middle-class writers for middle-class readers. Being punctual demonstrated that you, your business, your home, your railway was well managed, disciplined, reliable. It showed you had what the Victorians called character. Character. That word appears constantly in Victorian writings about time. They believed that character was built through the accumulation of good habits, and punctuality was perhaps the most important habit of all. If you could discipline yourself to be on time every time you were building character, you were becoming a better person. You were ascending toward moral perfection. And if you couldn't, well, there's this heartbreaking diary entry I came across from a young Victorian woman who wrote, "Arrived 7 minutes late to tea at Mrs. Harrington's. Mortified beyond words. I could see in her eyes that she had judged me and found me wanting. How shall I ever recover her good opinion?" 7 minutes. Her whole world crumbled over 7 minutes. Think about the psychological weight of this. Every single social interaction became a test. Every appointment was a chance to prove your worth or reveal your inadequacy. The ticking of the clock wasn't neutral, it was accusatory. Are you going to make it? Are you going to fail? Are you a person of character or a person of chaos? Victorian business culture took this even further. There are accounts of employers standing at the factory gates with watches in hand, noting exactly which workers arrived on time and which arrived even 30 seconds late. Those who were late faced fines, public humiliation or dismissal. Your livelihood depended on your ability to synchronize your life to the clock. And here's something I find particularly telling. In the 1880s, there was a boom in the production of pocket watches. Suddenly, working-class people who had never owned timepieces before were buying watches. Not because they particularly wanted to know what time it was, but because society demanded it. You needed to prove you could be punctual, and you couldn't do that without your own timepiece. So punctuality created a whole consumer market. Watchmakers got rich selling the tools of temporal compliance. And the watches themselves became status symbols. The fancier your watch, the more seriously you took time, the more respectable you appeared. But the really wild thing, despite all this obsessive focus on being exactly on time, despite all the anxiety and the watches and the public clocks and the synchronized railway signals, people still ran late sometimes. They were human. Accidents happened. Carriages broke down. Children got sick. Life interfered. And when that happened, the apology letters they're devastating to read. People would write these elaborate grovelling apologies for being 5 or 10 minutes late. They would explain in excruciating detail what had gone wrong, swearing on everything holy that it would never happen again, begging forgiveness, offering to make amends, for being late to tea, for arriving at a business meeting 6 minutes after the appointed hour. The level of shame they felt comes through in every word, because they had internalized the message that lateness equaled moral failure. They believed it. It wasn't just a social rule they were following to avoid consequences. They genuinely believed that their tardiness revealed something rotten in their character, and that they were desperate to prove it was an aberration, not their true nature. Does this sound familiar to anyone? This feeling that if you're late, if you miss a deadline, if you don't optimize every minute, you're somehow failing at being human. The Victorians invented that feeling. They created it, systematized it, turned it into a moral imperative, and then passed it down through generations until it became the water we swim in. We think productivity guilt is a modern invention, something created by hustle culture and social media. But no. The Victorians were beating themselves up about wasted time and missed minutes 150 years ago. They just didn't have smartphones to track their failure in real time. So the next time you feel anxious about being late, the next time you apologize profusely for arriving 3 minutes after you said you would remember you're not just being polite, you're participating in a Victorian moral tradition that equates punctuality with human worth. And maybe, just maybe, knowing that might help you relax just a little bit. Because here's the thing the Victorians discovered, though they'd never admit it. All that stress about being exactly on time didn't actually make people better. It just made them more anxious. The clock became a tyrant and they became its servants forever. Watching forever. Calculating forever. Afraid of those precious minutes ticking away. But punctuality was just the beginning of the Victorian time obsession. Because once they'd established that you needed to be exactly on time to everything they needed, a system to enforce it across the entire society, they needed something bigger than pocket watches and personal responsibility. They needed institutions that could educate the masses about proper time discipline. And the institution they chose was perhaps the most powerful force in Victorian life, the railways themselves. Not just as transportation, but as moral teachers, time police, enforcers of a new temporal order reshape what it meant to be a civilized human being. The year is 1852 and something extraordinary is happening inside the Royal Observatory at Greenwich. A telegraph operator sits at his desk, hand poised over a brass key. At precisely 1 o'clock in the afternoon, an astronomical clock, accurate to within a fraction of a second, triggers an electrical impulse. The operator taps his key and that pulse shoots through copper wires, stretching across England, reaching railway stations, town halls and telegraph offices hundreds of miles away. In an instant, clocks across the nation twitch in unison, synchronized to Greenwich time. This daily ritual, this electrical heartbeat, pulsing through the veins of Britain, represented something the world had never seen before. Time was no longer a local phenomenon. It was a network, a system, a discipline, and the Victorians believed this system could save souls. I know that sounds dramatic, but listen to what they actually said. William Frederick Allen, who helped standardize time zones in America, declared that railroad trains are the great educators and monitors of the people in teaching and maintaining exact time. Educators, monitors. These weren't just his words, this was the prevailing belief among Victorian railway administrators and social reformers. They genuinely thought that trains could teach moral lessons better than schools, better than churches, better than parents. How did a form of transportation become a moral instructor? Let me paint you a picture of what this looked like in practice. You're a station master in a mid-sized town in 1865. Every single day you perform what is essentially a sacred ritual. You wait for the telegraph signal from Greenwich. When it arrives, and it arrives at exactly the same moment every day, you carefully adjust your station clock, not approximately, not close enough, exactly, down to the second if your equipment allows it. This isn't just about keeping trains on schedule. This is about maintaining civilization itself. Because here's what the Victorians believed: if the trains ran on time, society ran smoothly. If trains were unpunctual, if schedules were unreliable, it meant chaos, disorder, the breakdown of trust, and ultimately moral decay. There are railway company records from this era that are just fascinating to read. Train delays weren't just operational problems, they were treated as moral failures. A late train meant that somewhere someone hadn't done their job with sufficient diligence. Station masters would be reprimanded not just for inefficiency but for lacking in character. Engineers who couldn't keep their locomotives on the schedule were seen as unreliable men, possibly even dishonest men. The assumption was that if you couldn't manage time properly, you probably couldn't manage your own vices, your own impulses, your own moral life. This obsession with railway punctuality created some genuinely absurd situations. There are documented cases of passengers being left behind at stations because the train departed at the exact scheduled second, even though the passenger was literally running toward the platform, visible to everyone just 5 or 10 seconds away. But the schedule said depart at 3:47, and so at 3:47 that train moved. No exceptions. To wait even 10 seconds would be to compromise the entire moral framework. Can you imagine being that passenger? You can see the train, you're so close, you're shouting, waving, desperate. And the conductor looks at his pocket watch, looks at you and gives the signal to depart anyway. Because the rules are the rules, and time waits for no one, and your inability to arrive at 3:46 instead of 3:47 and 10 seconds has revealed your fundamental unsuitability for modern life. The cruelty of it is almost breathtaking. But from the Victorian perspective, it wasn't cruel, it was necessary. They were teaching lessons, they were disciplining the masses, they were creating a population that understood the sacred importance of punctuality. And it worked. Sort of. I mean, it definitely created anxiety. Victorian railway passengers lived in constant fear of missing their trains. The stress of it shows up everywhere in the literature of the time. Characters in novels are constantly rushing to catch trains, panicking about being late, experiencing disasters because they missed their connection by mere moments. But here's the really insidious part. The railways didn't just enforce punctuality, they claimed to define what punctuality even meant. Before standardized railway time, being late was a fuzzy concept. You might be late by the sun's position, but on time by the church bells. You might be delayed by your own watch, but early by someone else's timepiece. The railways eliminated all that ambiguity. Railway time was correct. Everything else was wrong. Station clocks became the ultimate authority. People would set their personal watches by the station clock, trusting that it had been synchronized to Greenwich that very day. The station became a temple of temporal truth, and the station master became a kind of priest mediating between cosmic astronomical time and ordinary human experience. I came across this incredible quote from a Victorian writer who said that synchronized time intervened in people's lives the way electric power, sewage or gas did, as a circulating fluid of modern urban life. Think about that metaphor. Time as a fluid piped into your home, your workplace, your consciousness, just like water or gas. You couldn't see it, but it was everywhere, sustaining you, regulating you, disciplining you. And just like water or gas, you paid a price if you didn't properly manage your consumption of time. Waste water, pay higher bills. Waste time, pay with your reputation, your job, your social standing. The railway timetables themselves became objects of almost religious reverence. These weren't casual schedules, they were printed with extraordinary precision. A train wouldn't depart at around 3 in the afternoon. It would depart at 3:43, exactly 3:43, and the timetable would list it down to the minute for every single stop along the route. Departure times, arrival times, connection times, all calculated and printed and distributed like scripture. Victorian travellers would study these timetables the way monks studied holy texts. They would memorize schedules. They would plan their entire days, their entire journeys around these precise printed minutes. And they would feel genuine distress when the schedule changed, because it wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a disruption to the moral order. Here's something that really struck me. There was this prevailing belief that if you disconnected a city from the railway and telegraph network for just 30 days, people would lose their sense of time entirely. The railways had supposedly trained citizens so thoroughly to depend on external time signals that without those signals they would drift into temporal chaos. One railway administrator claimed that if you secretly adjusted all the clocks in a city by 30 minutes during this disconnection, not one person in 1,000 would even notice. Whether that's true or not, it reveals something profound about Victorian psychology. They believed the railway had fundamentally changed human consciousness, that people no longer had an innate sense of time, they had outsourced that sense to the railway system. Your internal clock had been replaced by the station clock, your natural rhythms had been overwritten by the timetable. And they saw this as progress, as civilization, as evolution. The Science Museum in London has this wonderful artifact, an 1841 timetable from the Great Western Railway. At the bottom, in bold letters, it reads, "London time is kept at all the stations on the railway. Not suggested, not preferred, kept, like keeping the peace or keeping the faith. London time was something sacred that had to be guarded, maintained, enforced." The language is telling, isn't it? They didn't say all stations use London time or all stations follow London time. They said keep London time, as if time was a precious substance that could be lost if you weren't vigilant, as if every station master was a guardian of something holy. And in a way they were, because the Victorian railway system created what we might call a temporal panopticon. Do you know that concept? A panopticon is a prison design where all prisoners can be observed by a single guard, and because they never know when they're being watched, they internalize the discipline and watch themselves. The railways did this with time. They created a system where everyone knew that time was being monitored, synchronized, controlled from Greenwich, and so everyone monitored themselves. You didn't need a conductor standing over you with a stopwatch. You policed your own punctuality because you had internalized the belief that the railway, and by extension all of modern society, was watching, judging, evaluating your temporal discipline. There are these incredible records of railway company meetings where executives would discuss not just operational efficiency but moral improvement. They would talk about how their punctual trains were creating punctual people, how reliable schedules were teaching reliability of character, how the very act of arriving at a station on time and boarding a train that departed on time was a lesson in virtue that would ripple through all aspects of a person's life. One railway chairman gave a speech in the 1870s where he claimed that railway punctuality had reduced crime in cities. His logic: people who learn to respect time learn to respect all rules. If you could discipline yourself to catch the 6:15 train instead of the 6:16, you could discipline yourself not to steal, not to drink excessively, not to succumb to moral temptation. Now we might laugh at this. We might think it's absurd to connect train schedules to crime rates, but the Victorians believed it. They believed that time discipline was the foundation of all discipline. Master time, master yourself. Lose control of time, lose control of everything. And they built an entire infrastructure around this belief, not just physical infrastructure like tracks and stations and telegraph wires, but psychological infrastructure. Schools started teaching children about railway time, about the importance of punctuality, about reading timetables. Churches began setting their clocks by railway time. Businesses coordinated their hours around train schedules. The entire society synchronized itself to this system. What's kind of beautiful and kind of terrifying about all this is how total the transformation was. Within a generation, Britain went from a country where time was local, flexible and negotiable to a country where time was universal, rigid and morally charged. And the railways made it happen, but they didn't do it alone. Because while the railways were teaching punctuality through transportation, another Victorian institution was teaching them our discipline through something even more personal, even more invasive. They were going into people's homes, into their private thoughts, into their daily routines, and they were transforming the very concept of wasting time from a minor inconvenience into a cardinal sin. And this institution, it wasn't transportation. It wasn't technology. It was something far more powerful, far more intimate, far more destructive to peace of mind. It was the Victorian conscience itself, weaponized against idleness, armed with diaries and guilt, ready to judge every single minute you might dare to waste. Imagine opening your bedside drawer and pulling out a small leather-bound book. The pages are pristine numbered, waiting. It's January 1st, 1883, and you've just purchased one of the new pre-printed diaries that have become wildly popular across Victorian Britain. Inside the front cover there's an inscription you wrote to yourself: "This year I shall not waste a single hour." You mean it. You genuinely believe that with this diary, with careful planning, with moral fortitude, you can finally become the person you're supposed to be. Productive, efficient, virtuous. But here's what you don't know yet. This diary isn't going to liberate you, it's going to haunt you. By the end of the year, its pages will be filled not with accomplishments, but with apologies. Not with pride, but with shame. Because the Victorian diary became something the world had never quite seen before, a daily record of failure, a minutely detailed account of all the ways you disappointed yourself hour by hour, minute by minute. Let me share something that breaks my heart a little. There was a young Victorian woman named Beatrice Webb. She would later become famous as a social reformer and co-founder of the London School of Economics. But in April of 1883, she was just a 25-year-old woman trying to educate herself, trying to become someone significant, and she kept a diary. On April 30th, she wrote, "The time rushes and I accomplish nothing." 7 words, such simple words, but you can feel the anguish in them, can't you? The time rushes. It's not that time passes, it rushes. Like a river she's drowning in, pulling her forward while she flails and grasps and fails to do anything meaningful with it. Then, just a few weeks later in June, she wrote, "Wretchedly wasted week. No hard work done. Sick headache from overeating and under-exercising." Wretchedly. That word choice is so revealing, not unfortunately wasted, or regrettably wasted. Wretchedly. She felt wretched, miserable, despicable, worthless because she had wasted a week. And notice how she diagnoses herself. The headache isn't just a headache, it's punishment for moral failure. Overeating, under-exercising, she's keeping a ledger of her sins, and time is the currency she's squandering. Does this sound familiar to anyone listening? This feeling that every unproductive hour is evidence of your fundamental inadequacy, that rest equals laziness, that relaxation equals moral failure, that if you're not constantly improving, you're essentially dying. The Victorians invented this feeling. They systematized it. They turned it into a cultural imperative. And the tool they used was the diary. Now diaries had existed for centuries before the Victorian era. People had been recording their thoughts and experiences for generations. But something changed in the mid-1800s. The diary transformed from a record of the past into a weapon against the present and a blueprint for the future. This transformation happened because of a perfect storm of Victorian anxieties. The Industrial Revolution had made time measurable in new ways. Factory bells divided the day into precise segments. Productivity could be quantified, tracked, optimized. And the Victorian middle class desperate to prove themselves respectable, desperate to distinguish themselves from the poor below them, and worthy of the aristocrats above them, latched onto this idea that you could measure your moral worth by how efficiently you used your time. The evangelical religious movement poured fuel on this fire. Ministers preached that every moment was a gift from God and wasting that gift was a sin, not just a minor sin, a serious moral transgression. If God had given you time and you squandered it on idleness or frivolity or even just rest, you were essentially spitting in God's face. There's this incredible pamphlet from Birmingham in 1840 called Rules for the Behaviour of Children. Among its religious instructions, it commands, be diligent in business. Reason. Because with the blessing of the Lord, it ensures success. Be diligent in business. Even children were being taught that constant busyness, constant productivity was next to godliness. The pamphlet explicitly connects diligence with God's blessing and success. The implication is clear: if you're not successful, it's because you haven't been diligent enough. You've wasted time. You've failed God. This is where Victorian diary culture gets truly dark, because the diary became a confessional, a place where you admitted your temporal sins. Day after day, Victorians would open their diaries and write variations of the same anguished theme: did not accomplish what I intended today. Wasted several hours on the trifling matters. Failed again to adhere to my schedule. These aren't occasional entries, these are constant refrains. Victorian diaries are absolutely saturated with this kind of self-flagellation. And the fascinating thing is that the more someone wrote about wasting time, the more time they wasted feeling guilty about wasting time. It was a vicious cycle of shame. But the diary revolution went even deeper than just recording failures, because Victorian entrepreneurs saw an opportunity. If people were obsessed with managing their time, why not sell them tools to do it better? And so the pre-printed diary was born. Before this, if you kept a diary, you bought a blank book and wrote in it however you wanted. But in the mid-Victorian era, stationery companies started producing diaries with dated pages, time slots, sections for appointments and tasks, and financial records. These weren't journals for reflection, they were organizational systems. And they sold like wildfire. Everyone wanted one. Businessmen needed them to track meetings and transactions. Housewives needed them to coordinate servants and social obligations. Even working-class people started buying cheap versions, trying to prove they too could be organized, efficient, modern. The genius of these pre-printed diaries was that they made you accountable to the future. A blank diary lets you record whatever happens, but a dated diary with its empty slot staring at you demands that you fill it. It asks, what are you going to do on Thursday the 15th? What will you accomplish on Saturday the 23rd? The future becomes a series of empty boxes waiting to be filled with productivity, and every empty box is an accusation. I want you to imagine what this felt like. It's evening, you're exhausted. You sit down with your diary to record the day, but the page doesn't just have blank space, it has sections. Morning activities, afternoon appointments, evening tasks, personal improvement. And you have to fill them in. You have to account for every hour. And if you spent 3 hours doing nothing particularly productive, if you sat and stared out the window lost in thought, if you took a nap, if you read a novel just for pleasure, you have to write that down. You have to see it in black and white. You have to confront the evidence of your wasted day. The psychological impact was enormous. Victorians became obsessed with what they called managing their time, as if time was a wild horse that needed to be broken and controlled. Self-help books proliferated, all promising to teach you how to squeeze more productivity out of every hour. Time management guides became bestsellers, and here's the kicker: none of it worked. People didn't actually become more productive, they just became more anxious. There are countless Victorian diary entries where people write about their time management systems, their elaborate schedules, their determination to finally get control of their days, and then, a week later, more apologies for failing to follow the system. A month later, abandoning the system entirely. 6 months later, trying a new system with renewed hope. It's almost funny, except it's so sad. These were people torturing themselves, convinced that if they could just find the right system, the right diary format, the right schedule, they could achieve some kind of temporal perfection that would prove their worth. Let me tell you about one Victorian gentleman whose diary I came across in my research. He created what he called a daily achievement chart. Every day was divided into 30-minute blocks from 6 in the morning until 10 at night. Each block had to be assigned a task and then marked as completed, partially completed, or failed. At the end of each week, he would tally his completion rate. If he achieved less than 80% completion, he would write himself a formal letter of reprimand outlining his failures and setting penalties, usually denying himself some small pleasure like his evening pipe or his Saturday walk. This man was so consumed with tracking his time that he essentially turned himself into his own factory supervisor, complete with productivity metrics and punishment for underperformance. And the tragedy is that he thought this was virtue. He thought this was self-improvement. He thought he was becoming a better person. But what he was actually becoming was miserable. The pressure to constantly document and justify your use of time created what we might recognize today as productivity anxiety or time scarcity syndrome. Victorians genuinely believed they didn't have enough time, even though by historical standards they had more leisure time than almost any previous generation. The wealthy had servants to do their labour. The middle class had shorter work hours than their grandparents. Technology was supposedly making life easier, but they felt more time-starved than ever because they had transformed time from a neutral resource into a moral test. Every hour had to justify its existence. Every minute had to prove its worth. There's this heartbreaking paradox in Victorian time diaries. People would write about how they needed to spend more time on self-improvement, reading, improving books, practicing useful skills, engaging in productive hobbies. But then they would feel guilty about the time spent on self-improvement because it wasn't economically productive. They couldn't win, leisure was sinful, but work without improvement was mechanical, but improvement without economic value was self-indulgent. There was no safe harbour. A Victorian social reformer named Samuel Smiles, and yes, that was really his name, wrote a hugely influential book called Self-Help in 1859. In it he argued that character was built through the accumulation of good habits, and the most important habit was the productive use of time. He wrote, "Lost wealth may be replaced by industry-lost knowledge, by study-lost health, by temperance, or medicine, but lost time is gone forever." Lost time is gone forever. That sentence echoed through Victorian consciousness like a death knell. It made every wasted minute a small death, every idle hour a permanent loss that could never be recovered. The pressure was unbearable, and Victorians internalized this so completely that it shows up everywhere in their personal writings. Love letters would include apologies for taking time to write. Mothers would feel guilty for playing with their children instead of doing something productive. The artists would flagellate themselves for hours spent in creative exploration that didn't immediately produce sellable work. The cult of productivity invaded every corner of Victorian life, and the diary was its high priest demanding confession, imposing penance, promising salvation through perfect time management that never ever came. Now you might be thinking, well, at least modern people have moved past this Victorian nonsense, and I wish that were true, I really do. But pull out your phone right now. How many productivity apps do you have? How many habit trackers? How many to-do lists? How many ways are you currently measuring whether you're using your time properly? We've just digitized the Victorian diary. That's all we've done. Upgraded the technology while keeping the same fundamental belief that your worth as a human being can be measured by how efficiently you use every minute of every day. The Victorians would look at our Fitbits, our screen time reports, our productivity dashboards, and they would feel right at home. They invented this trap. We've just made it portable and connected to the internet. But here's what I find most interesting about all this Victorian time anxiety. Despite all the guilt, despite all the systems, despite all the diary entries lamenting wasted hours, somehow Victorian society actually accomplished incredible things. They built railways across continents, they made scientific breakthroughs, they created art and literature that we still treasure. They engineered the modern world. So maybe, and this is just a thought, maybe the guilt didn't help. Maybe the constant self-monitoring didn't make them better. Maybe they achieved great things, not because of their time obsession, but in spite of it. Maybe those wasted hours staring out windows were actually necessary. Maybe rest wasn't sin. Maybe the diary was lying when it said every unscheduled minute was a failure. But the Victorians couldn't see that. They were too deep in the system. Too convinced that time discipline equaled moral discipline, too certain that if they could just manage their hours perfectly, they would finally be good enough. And that belief didn't just shape their personal lives, it shaped how they structured their entire society right down to the most basic activities. Because if wasting time was a sin in private, it was absolutely unforgivable in public. And nowhere was this more evident than in the rigid, almost military precision they applied to the most routine social interactions. The Victorians didn't just want you to manage your time well, they wanted you to prove it publicly, repeatedly in ways both large and small. And they created elaborate rules to make absolutely certain that every minute of your social life could be measured, judged, and found either acceptable or wanting. Here's something that will absolutely blow your mind. The Victorians believed that morning time and afternoon time were morally different. Not practically different, morally different. As in the same activity performed at 10 in the morning had a completely different moral quality than the exact same activity performed at 3 in the afternoon. And they built an entire social code around this bizarre belief, complete with different clothes, different rules, different acceptable behaviours, all determined by whether the sun was rising or falling in the sky. Let me give you the most absurd example of this, and I promise you this is historically accurate. In Victorian Britain, it was illegal to get married after noon, not socially frowned upon, not considered improper, actually illegal. The law stated that marriages could only be solemnized between the hours of 8 in the morning and 12 noon. If the clock struck 12:01 and you weren't yet married, the ceremony had to stop. Didn't matter if the bride was walking down the aisle. Didn't matter if the vows were half spoken. 12:01 meant the morning was over, and marriage belonged to the morning. Can you imagine your wedding day? Everything is perfect. The flowers, the guests, the nervousness, and joy and anticipation. But the vicar started the ceremony a bit late, got a bit long-winded in his opening remarks, and now it's 11:58. You're racing through your vows. The vicar is speeding up his liturgy. Everyone is watching the clock in panic. 11:59. You exchange rings in a blur. 1200 hours. The vicar declares you married with literally seconds to spare. Or worse, he doesn't. The clock strikes noon before the final words are spoken, and legally you're not married. The ceremony is invalid. You have to reschedule for another morning, endure. The shame explained to all your guests that you failed to get married within the acceptable time window. Why? What possible moral difference could there be between 11:59 and 12:01? The Victorians had an answer, and it was connected to this deeply held belief that morning hours were pure, fresh, virtuous hours, while afternoon and evening hours were progressively less so. Morning was when respectable people did respectable things. Morning was when your mind was clear, your judgment sound, your moral fibre strongest. Afternoon was when you might start to tire, to relax your standards, to make questionable choices. And evening was when all sorts of moral dangers lurked. This wasn't just about marriages. This morning versus afternoon obsession infected every aspect of Victorian social life, and nowhere was it more visible or more ridiculous than in the clothing rules. The Ladies' Book of Etiquette and Manual of Politeness from 1872 laid out the law very clearly. It is in as bad taste to receive your morning calls in an elaborate evening dress as it. And the sentence continues, but you get the idea. Wearing the wrong type of dress at the wrong time of day was equivalent to a serious breach of taste, judgment, and propriety. Victorian ladies had to change clothes multiple times a day, not because they wanted to, not because the clothes got dirty, but because time demanded it. You wore a morning dress in the morning, you changed into an afternoon dress in the afternoon. You changed into an evening dress for dinner and evening activities. Each dress was distinct with different fabrics, different colours, different levels of ornamentation. And here's the thing, these weren't subtle differences. A morning dress was relatively simple with high necklines and long sleeves made of sturdy fabrics like cotton or wool. An afternoon dress was more decorative but still modest. An evening dress was the elaborate, beautiful thing you see in period dramas. Lower necklines, fancy fabrics, lots of ornamentation. But the rules went beyond just having different dresses. You had to wear the right dress at the right time. If someone came to call on you at 11 in the morning and you were still in your nightdress, that was scandalous but understandable. Perhaps you'd been ill. But if they came at 11 and you were wearing an evening dress, that was incomprehensible. It suggested you'd been up all night at some party engaging in who knows what improprieties and hadn't yet gone to bed. It suggested moral chaos. Similarly, if you showed up for an afternoon tea party wearing a morning dress, you were either hopelessly ignorant of social rules or deliberately insulting your hostess by suggesting her event wasn't important enough to merit proper attire. The amount of mental energy this consumed is staggering. Victorian women had to constantly track not just the time, but what the time meant for their wardrobe. Is it still morning? Can I wear this for another hour? When does afternoon officially begin? Should I change now or wait 30 minutes? And it wasn't just the ladies. Men had their own versions of this madness, though slightly less elaborate. Morning coats, afternoon frock coats, evening tailcoats, different hats for different times of day. Even the accessories had temporal rules, certain cravat styles for morning, different ones for evening. But the clothes were just the visible manifestation of a deeper strangeness. Because the Victorians genuinely believed that different times of day were appropriate for different types of activities, different types of conversations, even different types of emotions. Morning was for business, for industry, for serious matters. The etiquette books are very clear about this. Morning visiting hours, typically between 11 and 1 o'clock, were for brief formal calls. You didn't linger. You didn't engage in deep conversation. You presented your calling card, exchanged pleasantries, and left. 10 to 20 minutes maximum. Afternoon from around 3 to 6 o'clock was when you could visit a bit longer, engage in more substantive conversation, actually enjoy the company. But you still had to watch the clock, because overstaying your welcome in the afternoon was almost as bad as arriving late. Evening was for intimacy, for closer friends, for dinner parties and balls and more relaxed social interaction. But even then, everything was timed. You didn't arrive too early or too late. You didn't leave too soon or linger too long. There was this entire choreography of time that governed Victorian social life, and everyone was expected to know it, to follow it, to prove through their perfect timing that they were civilized, modern, respectable people. Here's a detail I love. If you were going to visit someone in the afternoon, you had to be very careful about when you arrived. Too early, let's say 2:30, when calling hours started at 3, and you were suggesting the host wasn't prepared, catching them off guard, imposing yourself. Too late, arriving at 5:45 when calling hours ended at 6 and you were being inconsiderate, giving them barely any time to entertain you properly before they had to start preparing for evening activities. The sweet spot was roughly 30 minutes to an hour after the calling period began and at least an hour before it ended. So for afternoon calls from 3 to 6, you should arrive between 3:30 and 4:30. This wasn't written down anywhere as an exact rule, but everyone somehow knew it. And if you got it wrong, people noticed. People judged. Can you imagine living like this? Every social interaction requiring precise timing calculations, you'd need to account for travel time, potential delays, the relationship between you and the person you're visiting, the importance of the occasion, and then arrive at exactly the right moment to signal all the correct things about your social awareness and respect for temporal proprieties. And heaven help you if you mixed up morning and afternoon conventions. There are accounts of social disasters where someone showed up for a morning call at 11 but stayed for 45 minutes afternoon length and essentially committed social suicide. The host didn't know how to politely eject them. Other visitors couldn't arrive because this person was monopolizing the morning calling period. Gossip spread, reputation suffered. The flip side of this was that you could never spontaneously visit someone. The modern idea of dropping by to see a friend would have been absolutely horrifying to Victorians. Visiting required planning, coordination, and respect for the time windows. There's this wonderful passage in an etiquette manual that says a well-mannered Victorian would never dream of dropping in on friends unannounced. The ritual of calling cards, those small printed cards with your name, existed precisely to avoid this horror. You didn't just show up. You sent your card ahead. The recipient decided if and when they would receive you, and then you appeared at the appointed hour. Not before, not after, exactly. The obsession with morning virtue versus afternoon relaxation even extended to what you could eat and drink at different times. Certain foods were appropriate for morning, different foods for afternoon. Alcohol in the morning was absolutely forbidden for respectable people. It suggested you were a drunkard who couldn't wait until the appropriate hour. But afternoon and evening, perfectly acceptable, even expected in social situations. There are records of Victorian doctors prescribing morning constitutionals walks taken before noon as being particularly healthful, more so than afternoon walks. Why? Because the morning air was somehow morally superior. The same oxygen molecules, the same sunlight, but because it was before noon, it had greater virtue. This is what I find both fascinating and sad about Victorian time beliefs. They took something arbitrary, the division between morning and afternoon, and assigned it enormous moral weight. They convinced themselves that these divisions were natural, important, reflective of cosmic truth, when really it was just a social construct designed to create more ways to judge people and enforce class distinctions. Because here's the thing about all these time-based rules, they required leisure to follow. If you were a working-class person labouring in a factory from dawn to dusk, you couldn't change clothes 3 times a day. You couldn't make social calls during the proper morning hours because you were working. You couldn't follow the intricate dance of Victorian temporal etiquette. So by definition, knowing and following these rules proved you weren't working class. It proved you had time, had resources, had education. The temporal rules weren't really about morality or virtue. They were about exclusion. They were a way for the middle and upper classes to identify their own and keep everyone else out. A working woman wearing the same dress all day wasn't just being practical, she was revealing her class status. A man who couldn't take morning calls because he was at his shop lower class. Someone who didn't know that marriages must occur before noon, obviously not refined enough to associate with. The cruelty of it is breathtaking when you think about it. The Victorians created elaborate rules that required significant time and resources to follow, then judged people who couldn't follow those rules as morally deficient. It's like creating a game where only the wealthy can play, then declaring that winning the game proves you're a better person. And the morning-afternoon distinction was just one piece of this. There were rules about what day of the week you could make certain types of visits, rules about how long you could walk with someone based on where you were walking, rules about conversation length depending on whether you were in the street or in a garden. The etiquette book from the 1850s that I mentioned earlier, The Habits of Good Society, actually specifies that in the streets conversations must be short because you wouldn't want to hold up traffic. But when taking a longer promenade through a garden, discussions could take more time. Think about that. The same conversation, let's say you're discussing your thoughts on a new novel, is subject to different time limit depending on your physical location. On the street, 3 minutes maximum. In a garden, you can stretch it to 10 or 15 minutes. Why? Because the street is for business and efficiency, while the garden is for leisure and contemplation, and time itself has different qualities in these different spaces. It's almost philosophical in its absurdity. Time is relative not to velocity, as Einstein would later propose, but to location and activity type according to the Victorians. And if you think all this couldn't possibly get more complicated, just wait, because we haven't even touched on the most stressful temporal challenge in Victorian social life. We haven't discussed the event where one wrong move with timing could destroy your reputation permanently. We haven't talked about the Victorian dinner party, where every course had its own timeline, where the gaps between dishes were scrutinised, where the speed at which you ate was a moral statement, and where the entire evening was a carefully orchestrated temporal performance that required the precision of a military operation and the grace of a ballet. The dinner table was where Victorian time obsession reached its peak, where every minute of the meal told a story about who you were and whether you deserved a place in civilized society. You're seated at a beautifully appointed Victorian dining table. Crystal glimmers in the candlelight. Silver cutlery is arranged in bewildering formations on either side of your plate. Multiple forks, multiple knives, multiple spoons, each with its own mysterious purpose. The other guests are arriving, being announced by the butler, finding their assigned seats through an elaborate system you don't fully understand. Your heart is racing, and not from excitement, from terror, because you know that over the next 3 hours you're about to be judged on approximately 1,000 different temporal micro-behaviors, and any one of them could expose you as uncouth, unrefined, unworthy of this company. The first test comes before you even sit down. You arrived at exactly 7 o'clock as instructed, but now you're waiting. The hostess is chatting with guests, the host is offering sherry, and you're standing there wondering, do I sit? Do I wait to be told? How long should this pre-dinner mingling last? 5 minutes, 15, what if I sit too soon? Here's what the etiquette manuals prescribed, and I want you to hear how insanely specific this gets. Guests were expected to assemble in the drawing room first, not the dining room. They would socialise for approximately 15 to 20 minutes, no more, no less. Then dinner would be announced by the butler or a servant, and here's where it gets choreographed like a military manoeuvre. The host would take each gentleman aside and quietly tell him which lady he would escort to the dining room. This assignment was based on an incredibly complex hierarchy of precedence, rank, title, age, marital status, social importance. If you were a young, untitled man, you might be assigned to escort an elderly spinster aunt. If you were a man of some importance, you might escort the second most important lady. The most important male guest escorted the hostess herself, and God forbid the host made a mistake in this pecking order. If Lady So-and-so was escorted by someone of lower rank than she deserved, The insult could end friendships, torpedo business relationships, create family feuds that lasted generations, all because someone was paired with the wrong dinner companion based on social mathematics. Once the assignments were made, couples processed to the dining room in strict order of precedence. The most important couple first, then descending through the ranks. Imagine being the least important people walking in last, knowing that your position in the procession just announced to everyone your lowly status. But here's where timing becomes absolutely critical. The procession couldn't happen too fast or too slow. A stately, dignified pace was required. Not a funeral march, not a casual stroll, but something in between that communicated both formality and grace. And then once you reached the dining room, you didn't immediately sit. You stood behind your assigned chair and waited for the hostess to sit first. Only when she was seated could everyone else sit, simultaneously, in one choreographed moment. Already exhausted. We haven't even started eating yet. Now comes the most famous rule of Victorian dining, the one that shocks modern people the most. As soon as your food was placed in front of you, you were required to begin eating immediately. Not wait for others, not pause politely, immediately. The etiquette book is very clear about this. As soon as you are helped begin to eat, or if the viands are too hot for your palate, take up your knife and fork and appear to begin. To wait for others is now not only old-fashioned, but ill-bred. Ill-bred. Waiting for everyone to be served, which we consider polite today, was considered rude in Victorian times. Why? Because the Victorians believed that hot food must be eaten hot and cold food must be eaten cold, and waiting would ruin the food. But more than that, they believed that hesitating revealed weakness, indecision, excessive deference that suggested you didn't know your own worth. So you'd have this bizarre situation where the first person served would immediately start eating while servants were still placing food in front of other guests. By the time the last person was served, the first person might be halfway through their course. The table was a staggered timeline of eating everyone at slightly different points in the meal, and the pace at which you ate also subject to scrutiny. Too fast suggested you were ravenous, possibly of lower class origins where food was scarce and you had to eat quickly before someone took it. Too slow suggested you were finicky, difficult to please, or worst of all that you didn't like the food and were being insulting to your host. You had to eat at what was considered the correct speed, not too fast, not too slow, Goldilocks eating. And somehow everyone was supposed to know what this correct speed was without it ever being explicitly stated. Here's something that will make you laugh and cringe at the same time. Victorian hosts would deliberately engineer the timing of their food to control how much guests could eat. There's this incredible detail about ice cream service. Hosts would serve ice cream with a sort of combination spoon and fork, a spork basically that had wide gaps between the tines. This utensil was specifically designed so that you could only eat solid chunks of ice cream. Once the ice cream started melting and became more liquid, it would fall through the gaps in the spork, making it impossible to consume. So the amount of ice cream you could eat was determined by how fast it melted and how quickly you could extract the solid portions with this ridiculous utensil. It was forced portion control through physics and timing. Once you could no longer get chunks of ice cream onto your spork, you were finished no matter how much you might have wanted to lap up the melted deliciousness. That would be vulgar beyond words. The timing between courses was another source of anxiety. Servants were trained to clear one course and present the next with precise timing. Too long between courses suggested poor household management servants who didn't know their jobs, a host who couldn't coordinate their staff. Too quick suggested the host was rushing you through the meal, eager to be done with you. The ideal gap was approximately 3 to 5 minutes. Time enough to set down your utensils, dab your mouth with your napkin, perhaps take a sip of wine, but not so long that conversation lapsed or people became restless. And the servants themselves, they were timed like Olympic athletes. They had to move quietly, efficiently, almost invisibly. They would enter from the serving door, move around the table in a specific direction, always the same direction, always the same patterns, place or remove plates without making noise and exit before anyone really noticed they'd been there. The service was supposed to be rapid and noiseless, as one etiquette book demanded. If a servant dropped something, made a noise, took too long, or heaven forbid spoke unless absolutely necessary, it reflected poorly on the entire household. The host's ability to manage time extended to managing the temporal precision of their servants. Now, about those wine glasses in front of you. There might be 4 or 5 different glasses: water, white wine, red wine, champagne, port. And there were rules about when you could drink from which glass, how much you could drink, and who was responsible for ensuring your glass was filled. Here's a genuinely strange rule: ladies were not supposed to ask for wine. It was considered inappropriate, forward, almost scandalous. Instead, they had to rely on the gentleman seated next to them to notice when their glass was empty and request the servant to fill it. If you were a woman and your dinner companion was oblivious or inconsiderate, you just went thirsty. Asking directly was unthinkable. But the men had their own anxiety. They were supposed to monitor not just their own wine consumption, but also the consumption of the ladies on either side of them. Too much attention to the ladies' wine glasses suggested you were trying to get them drunk, scandalous implications. Too little attention suggested you were a bore who didn't understand proper hospitality. Again, there was a perfect balance you were supposed to strike, and again nobody explicitly told you what it was. The etiquette books do mention rather hilariously that young ladies seldom drank more than 3 glasses of wine at dinner, but married ladies, professional ladies, and those accustomed to society could drink significantly more. So you had to know the marital status and social experience of your dinner companion to know how much wine service to facilitate. The complexity is mind-boggling. Conversation at the table was also timed. When you first sat down, you were expected to speak primarily to the person on your right, midway through the meal, and the signal for this was often when the hostess subtly turned her attention from one dinner companion to the other. Everyone would switch and speak primarily to the person on their left. This turning the table was supposed to happen smoothly, naturally, all at once. If you missed the cue and kept talking to your first companion while everyone else had switched, you looked socially deaf, unaware, incompetent. And what you talked about was also regulated. Politics and religion were absolutely forbidden. Controversial topics were out. You were supposed to engage in pleasant, light conversation that demonstrated your wit and education without causing offence or requiring too much mental effort from your companions. But here's the catch: you couldn't be too entertaining. If you monopolized the conversation, told too many stories, made yourself the center of attention, you were showing off and being rude. But if you were too quiet, contributed too little, you were a dull companion and would never be invited back. Once again, perfect balance required. The entire dinner could last 3 hours or more. Multiple courses: soup, fish, meat, game, dessert, fruit, cheese, each with its own wine, each with its own utensils, each with its own timing. By the end, you were mentally exhausted from the concentration required to navigate all these temporal and social rules. And then came the final timing challenge. When did you leave? Too early suggested you didn't enjoy yourself or had somewhere more important to be. Too late suggested you were inconsiderate, overstaying your welcome, oblivious to social cues. There was a correct window for departure, usually an hour or 2 after dinner concluded, but it varied based on the formality of the occasion, your relationship to the hosts, and countless other factors. Gentlemen had an additional rule from the Gentleman's Book of Etiquette and Manual of Politeness from 1876. Do not be the last to leave the ballroom. Being the last to leave suggested you had nowhere else to go, no other social obligations, possibly no other friends. It marked you as desperate for company socially marginal, so you had to time your exit carefully. Not first, not last, somewhere in the comfortable middle of the departure wave. The amount of anxiety this created is evident in Victorian letters and diaries. People would write to friends asking advice about dinner party timing. How long should I stay after dinner at the Hendersons? They're not close friends, but Mr. Henderson is important to my husband's business. Should I leave before or after the Dowager Duchess? I don't want to insult her by leaving first, but I also don't want to presume to leave at the same time. Every dinner invitation was a minefield of temporal decisions, and any one of them could explode your social standing. Here's what makes all this particularly tragic. The Victorians claimed these elaborate rules existed to make social interaction smoother, more pleasant, more predictable. The rules were supposed to reduce anxiety by telling everyone exactly what to do and when to do it. But of course, the opposite happened. The rules created anxiety. They transformed a simple meal into a performance where you were constantly being evaluated. They made every dinner party a test you might fail, every social gathering a potential humiliation. And who suffered most from this? Not the aristocracy who were born into these rules and had servants to help them navigate the complexity. Not the working class who weren't invited to these dinners anyway, but the rising middle class desperately trying to prove they belonged in refined society, terrified of making a mistake that would reveal their origins, studying etiquette books like scripture and still never quite confident they'd gotten it right. The dinner table became a battleground where class warfare was fought with soup spoons and wine glasses, where your place in society was determined by whether you knew to eat your ice cream quickly before it melted, whether you turned to your left dinner companion at the correct moment, whether you left the party in the acceptable window of time. It's exhausting just thinking about it, isn't it? And we've only covered dinner parties. We haven't even touched on the ways Victorians regulated time in the workplace, how the factory clock became an instrument of control and punishment, how the very concept of being on the clock transformed human labour into measurable, monitored, minutely controlled units of time. The dinner table was complex, but the factory floor. That's where Victorian time discipline became truly brutal, where every second mattered not for etiquette but for survival, where the tick of the clock could mean the difference between employment and destitution. The factory bell clangs at 5:55 in the morning. It's still dark outside. You've been awake for 20 minutes already because you live 30 minutes away and you need to arrive by 6 o'clock sharp. Not 6:01, not 6:02, 600 hours exactly. Because standing at the factory gate is your foreman pocket watch in hand, noting down the exact arrival time of every single worker. And if your name goes down next to 6:03, even once you'll find your weekly wages reduced. Do it twice and you might find yourself without a job entirely. Welcome to Victorian industrial time discipline, where the clock didn't just measure your day, it owned your life. We've been talking about how the Victorians were obsessed with time in their social lives, in their dinner parties, in their morning versus afternoon rituals. But all of that pales in comparison to what happened in the workplace. Because when the Industrial Revolution transformed Britain from an agricultural society to an industrial powerhouse, it didn't just change what people did for work. It changed the fundamental nature of time itself. Before factories, most people worked according to natural rhythms and task completion. If you were a farmer, you worked from sunrise to sunset, with the pace determined by season's weather and the needs of your crops and animals. If you were a craftsman, you worked until your product was finished. Time was flexible, organic, tied to tangible outcomes rather than arbitrary units. But factories couldn't work that way. Factories needed coordination. If you were running a textile mill with 200 workers and dozens of machines all interconnected, everyone had to start at the same time, take breaks at the same time, work at the same pace. The factory system required synchronization, and synchronization required the clock. So the Victorians did something revolutionary, and when you really think about it, kind of horrifying. They turned human labor into a measurable commodity that could be bought and sold by the hour, by the minute, eventually by the second. Your time was no longer yours. It belonged to whoever paid your wages, and they wanted every penny's worth. The symbol of this transformation was the time clock. Now, mechanical time clocks weren't perfected until late in the Victorian era, but the concept existed from the beginning. Workers would clock in and clock out, literally putting their time on record. Their hours were tallied, calculated, paid for, or docked based on precise measurements. But here's what made this system particularly brutal. The clocks were controlled by the factory owners, and there are many documented cases of factory owners deliberately running the factory clocks slow during work hours and fast during breaks. So your 8-hour shift might actually be 9 hours, but according to the factory clock, you'd only worked 8. So that's all you'd be paid for. Workers couldn't prove this fraud because they didn't have reliable timepieces of their own. The working class couldn't afford accurate watches. They had no choice but to trust the factory clock, even when their bodies told them something was wrong, even when the winter darkness said they'd been working far too long. This is where Victorian time beliefs became genuinely cruel, because the middle and upper classes preached that punctuality was a moral virtue, that disciplined use of time built character, that everyone should respect the clock. But in practice, the clock was a weapon used by the powerful against the powerless. Let me give you some specific examples of how this worked. In the textile mills of Manchester in the 1840s, workers were required to arrive before the engine started. The starting time was 6 o'clock, but the factory gates would close at 6:02. If you arrived at 6:03, you were locked out. Not just for a few minutes, for the entire quarter day. You'd lose a quarter of a day's wages because you were 3 minutes late. Think about that. 3 minutes of lateness cost you hours of pay. The disproportion is staggering, and it gets worse. If you were locked out multiple times, you could be fired. Your family could end up destitute because on one cold morning, you couldn't run quite fast enough to make it through the gates before they swung shut. Factory owners justified this cruelty by claiming they were teaching workers discipline, responsibility, the value of punctuality. They genuinely believed, or at least claimed to believe, that they were doing workers a favour by forcing them to internalise clock time. One factory owner wrote that his strict timekeeping rules were for the moral improvement of the working classes who too often lack the self-discipline necessary for the modern life. The condescension is breathtaking. These were people working 14-hour days in dangerous conditions for barely enough wages to survive, and their employers thought the real problem was that workers needed more discipline. But the obsession with worker punctuality went even deeper. Some factories employed knocker-uppers, people whose job was to go around working-class neighbourhoods in the early morning, tapping on windows with long poles to wake workers up in time for their shifts. This was actually a profession. People paid other people to make sure they woke up on time because the consequences of being late were so severe. Imagine living in a world where you need to hire someone to wake you up because if you sleep 20 minutes too long, your children might go hungry. That's not time discipline. That's time terror. And once you were inside the factory, the tyranny of the clock continued. Your breaks were timed to the minute. Lunch was typically 30 minutes, sometimes only 20. You ate quickly, often, standing up often with the machine still running around you. If you took 32 minutes instead of 30, you could be fined. Some factories had bells that would ring to signal different parts of the day. Start bell, break bell, lunch bell, end of shift bell. Workers' lives were segmented into these bell-defined chunks, and you moved from one to the next like parts on an assembly line. There are heartbreaking accounts from Victorian factory workers describing this experience. One textile worker wrote in his diary, "We are not men, but machines that happen to breathe. The clock tells us when to move, when to stop, when to eat, when to rest. We have no time of our own. Even our sleep is just preparation for the next shift, for the next day of surrendering our hours to the factory." The 8-hour workday, which we now consider standard, was actually a hard-won victory that took decades of labour organising to achieve. Before that, 12, 14, 16-hour days were common, and every single one of those hours was monitored, measured, extracted as efficiently as possible. Factory owners would hire supervisors whose entire job was to walk the floor with watches timing how long workers took to complete specific tasks. They would create what we might recognise as early time and motion studies, breaking down jobs into component parts and calculating how many seconds each part should take. If you weren't meeting the expected pace, you'd be reprimanded, fined, or replaced with someone who could move faster. The human body became subject to the same efficiency calculations as the machines. You were expected to operate at maximum capacity for the entire shift. No slowdowns, no variations, no accommodation for fatigue or illness or just having a rough day. Here's something that really illustrates the inhumanity of this system. In some factories, workers weren't allowed to carry personal watches or have any way to check the time independently. The factory clock was the only authority, and workers were deliberately kept ignorant of the actual time, so they couldn't track how long they'd been working or argue if the clock was being manipulated. It's like time gaslighting. You feel like you've been working for 10 hours, but the factory clock says 8, and you have no way to prove otherwise, so you start to doubt your own experience of time. The Victorian era also saw the development of what we now call shift work, and the factories that ran 24 hours needed workers around the clock, so they created multiple shifts: day shift, evening shift, night shift. This was revolutionary and deeply disorienting for workers. Human beings aren't designed to work night shifts. Our circadian rhythms are tied to daylight. But Victorian factories didn't care about biology, they cared about productivity. So workers found themselves trying to sleep during the day, work during the night, completely inverted from natural human patterns. And the shift would rotate. You might work days for 2 weeks, then switch to nights, then back to days. Your body never had time to fully adjust. Victorian medical records show increased rates of illness, accidents, and mental health problems among shift workers, but factory owners dismissed these concerns. Time was money, and keeping the factory running continuously was more profitable than worker well-being. The language that emerged around factory work is revealing. Workers talked about being on the clock versus off the clock. Time literally had an on-off switch determined by your employer. You clocked in, you clocked out. Your time became factory property during those hours, and even off-the-clock time wasn't fully yours, because you had to account for commuting time, sleeping enough to be functional for the next shift, preparing meals quickly so you didn't waste time that could be spent working or sleeping. The factory's temporal demands colonized your entire life. There's this concept that historians use called time discipline, and it refers to exactly this transformation from people controlling their own time to time controlling people. And the factory was the primary site where time discipline was beaten into the working class, sometimes literally. Because yes, physical punishment was used to enforce time discipline. Child workers, and there were many child workers in Victorian factories, could be struck for being slow or for taking unauthorised breaks. Adult workers could be docked pay, publicly humiliated, or fired for temporal infractions. One of the most insidious aspects of this system was how it created anxiety that extended beyond the workplace. Workers would lie awake at night worrying about oversleeping. They would rush through family time in the evenings because they needed to get to bed early enough to be rested for the next shift. They would skip meals or eat unhealthily fast to maximize sleep or save a few minutes. The factory clock didn't just regulate the hours you were physically in the factory, it regulated your entire existence. Every decision about how to spend your time had to account for the factory's demands. Now here's where Victorian hypocrisy becomes particularly glaring. Remember how we talked about the middle-class obsession with punctuality as a moral virtue, how being on time demonstrated good character and reliability? The middle class applied these standards to workers with brutal efficiency, fining or firing them for being minutes late. But when it came to paying wages on time, suddenly punctuality wasn't so important. There are countless records of factory owners delaying wage payments, sometimes by days or weeks. Workers would be told to come back tomorrow, come back next week. Their time had to be given exactly on schedule, but compensation for that time, that could wait. The power imbalance is so stark it's almost cartoonish. Workers must account for every second. Employers can be vague and flexible about payment. The clock as a tool of discipline only pointed in one direction downward. And yet the Victorian middle class convinced themselves that they were elevating the working class by teaching them time discipline. They genuinely believed that factory work, for all its hardships, was civilizing workers by forcing them to internalize clock time, to be punctual, to be reliable. There are Victorian sermons, social reform pamphlets, even poetry celebrating the factory clock as an instrument of moral education. One clergyman wrote that the factory whistle was the voice of progress, calling men and women away from the disorder of natural time into the ordered precision of industrial time, where they learn the habits that will save their souls as surely as it fills their pockets. Fill their pockets. With wages so low that families lived in desperate poverty, while working hours so long they barely saw their children. But sure, the factory clock was saving their souls. The tragic thing is that some workers internalized this. They began to believe that their worth as human beings was tied to their productivity, to their punctuality, to their ability to surrender their time completely to the demands of industrial capitalism. They would feel guilty for being sick, for needing rest, for wanting time with their families. The Victorian era created what we might call the productivity gospel. This belief that your value as a person is measured by how much you produce, how efficiently you use your time, how completely you submit to the clock. And that gospel is still being preached today. We've just replaced factory bells with email notifications and replaced time clocks with productivity tracking software. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, because there's another domain where Victorian time obsession played out in ways both absurd and revealing. We've covered the factory, the dinner party, the social call, but what about just walking down the street? What about the most ordinary everyday activity of being in public? Surely the Victorians couldn't regulate that with temporal precision, right? Oh, but they tried. They tried so hard, and the rules they created for public behaviour, for conversation length, for how long you could stand in one spot or walk at a certain pace reveal just how completely the clock had invaded every corner of Victorian life, even the simple act of moving through the world. You're walking down a busy London street on a crisp autumn afternoon in 1870. You see an acquaintance approaching someone you know socially, but not intimately. Your heart does a little flutter of anxiety because you know what's about to happen. You're going to have to engage in a street conversation, and street conversations in Victorian Britain had very specific time limits that were never written down, but absolutely enforced. Say too little and you're rude. Say too much and you're inconsiderate, blocking pedestrian traffic, demonstrating a shocking lack of awareness about the proper use of public space. So how long should this conversation last? 30 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes maximum. The Etiquette Manual, The Habits of Good Society from 1859, provides guidance that is somehow both helpful and maddeningly vague. In the streets, conversations were required to be short, wouldn't want to hold up traffic, but when taking a longer promenade through the garden, discussions were granted more time. Required to be short, not suggested, required. because apparently talking too long on a public street was a moral failing equivalent to blocking a fire exit or stealing someone's property. You were consuming public space inefficiently, and in Victorian Britain efficiency was godliness. But what does short mean? The manual doesn't specify. You're supposed to just know, and if you don't know if you're the kind of person who talks for 3 minutes when 2 minutes was the maximum, well, that reveals your lack of breeding, doesn't it? This is what fascinates me about Victorian street etiquette. They created all these elaborate temporal rules for public behaviour, but they kept them deliberately ambiguous, so that following them required insider knowledge. It was another way to separate the refined from the common, the educated from the ignorant. If you grew up in the right social circles, you absorbed these time limits through observation and gentle correction. You learned by watching how long your mother spoke to the vicar on the street, how quickly your father wrapped up a conversation with a business associate he encountered while walking. You developed an instinct for the correct duration. But if you didn't grow up in those circles, if you were newly wealthy, rising in social status, desperately trying to learn the rules, you had to study and practice and still probably got it wrong, marking yourself as an outsider despite your best efforts. Here's a specific example that shows how absurd this got. Women walking on Victorian streets were instructed on the exact technique for raising their skirts while crossing muddy pavements. The etiquette book specifies, when crossing the pavement, a lady should raise her dress with the right hand a little above the ankle. To raise the dress with both hands is vulgar and can only be excused when mud is very deep. Now notice what's happening here. This isn't just about technique, it's about timing. Because the implication is that you're supposed to raise your dress at exactly the right moment, not too early, not too late. Raise it too soon and you're showing your ankles unnecessarily, which is immodest. Raise it too late and you've already gotten mud on your hem, which shows poor judgment and poor timing, and you have to use one hand even if it's awkward, even if you're also carrying a parasol or a purse, because using two hands suggests you're so concerned with your dress that you've lost all sense of proportion and grace. Unless the mud is exceptionally deep, in which case 2 hands is acceptable, but only just barely. The amount of mental calculation required for simply walking across the street is staggering. You have to assess the mud depth, decide on the hand technique, time the dress raising moment, maintain proper posture, keep walking at an appropriate pace, and if you encounter someone you know, switch immediately to calculating the proper conversation length, and the pace at which you walked also subject to scrutiny. Too fast suggested you were in a hurry, possibly late to something which we know by now was a serious character flaw. Too slow suggested you were loitering, wasting time, possibly up to no good. There was a proper walking speed for respectable people, and it was apparently something you were supposed to intuit rather than have explicitly explained. Victorian illustrations and photographs show people walking with this very particular gait, upright posture, measured steps, not rushing, but not dawdling. The visual embodiment of temporal propriety. But here's where it gets really interesting. The rules change depending on where you were walking. On a busy commercial street during business hours, you were expected to walk with purpose and efficiency. But on a garden promenade or park path, especially in the afternoon when leisure was appropriate, you could slow down, take your time, actually enjoy the walk. The physical location changed the temporal rules. The same pace that was proper in Hyde Park during a promenade would be inappropriate on Fleet Street during the business day. How were you supposed to keep track of all this? How did anyone manage to leave their house without being paralyzed by anxiety? And then there was the question of stopping. If you stopped to look in a shop window, how long could you stand there before it became loitering? If you paused to admire a view, to catch your breath, to adjust your hat, was there a maximum duration before you crossed from reasonable pause to suspicious stillness? The Victorians worried about this. They genuinely worried that people standing still in public spaces were either up to no good or wasting time or both. There are accounts of police officers questioning people for standing in one spot too long. "What's your business here? Why are you loitering?" Because stillness in public suggested you had no productive purpose, no place you needed to be, no proper use for your time. This obsession with movement and efficiency in public spaces was connected to the broader Victorian anxiety about urban crowding. Victorian cities were growing explosively. London's population increased from about 1 million in 1800 to over 6 million by 1900. The streets were packed with people, animals, vehicles, all trying to move through limited space. So the Victorians created these informal rules about traffic flow, about not blocking pathways, about keeping conversations brief so you didn't create bottlenecks. And then they moralized these practical concerns, turning them into character judgments. If you blocked foot traffic with a long conversation, you weren't just being practically inconsiderate, you were revealing your moral inadequacy. There's this wonderful contradiction in Victorian street etiquette. On one hand, they valued public decorum, restraint, not drawing attention to yourself. But on the other hand, everyone was constantly watching everyone else, judging their temporal behaviour, their walking speed, their conversation length, their stopping patterns. The street was a theatre of judgment where everyone was simultaneously actor and audience. You performed temporal propriety while monitoring others' performances. The mutual surveillance was exhausting, and it extended to the smallest details. If you needed to greet someone while walking, there were rules about whether you stopped completely, slowed your pace, or just nodded while maintaining speed. The choice depended on your relationship to the person, the formality of the setting, the time of day, and how busy the street was. A close friend in an uncrowded park. You might stop for a brief chat, a business acquaintance on a busy commercial street, a nod and perhaps a few words while walking, someone of higher social rank. You definitely stopped, but they could choose whether to stop for you or just acknowledge you while continuing on. These micro-decisions about time and movement were happening constantly, subconsciously as people navigated public spaces, and making the wrong choice, stopping when you should have kept walking, or walking when you should have stopped, could create awkward moments that would be analysed and discussed later. Victorian letters and diaries are full of social post-mortems. I encountered Lady Pemberton on Oxford Street this afternoon and stopped to greet her, but she merely nodded and continued walking. I'm uncertain whether I've offended her or whether the street was simply too crowded for a proper conversation. Must send a calling card to clarify the situation. Imagine needing to send a calling card to clarify why someone didn't stop to talk to you on the street. The social anxiety is palpable, but the street wasn't just about conversations and walking pace. It was also about visibility and timing. When were you supposed to be seen in public? What times of day were appropriate for different types of people to be on the street? Respectable women, for instance, were generally not supposed to be out alone on the street after dark. Evening was for private social engagements, not public wandering. A woman walking alone at night was either assumed to be a prostitute or someone who had fallen into such desperate circumstances that she had no choice. Men had more freedom of movement, but even they were subject to temporal judgment. Being in certain parts of the city at certain times could damage your reputation. The theatre district after midnight, only if you were a rake, or worse, the financial district on a Sunday. Suspicious, what business could you possibly have there when all respectable commerce was closed? Your presence in space was timed, judged, interpreted. The city was a complex temporal map where different areas had different acceptable hours for different types of people. And this is where Victorian time obsession revealed something deeper about their worldview. They didn't just believe that you should use time efficiently. They believed that time itself had moral qualities that changed based on context, location, and purpose. Time spent working was virtuous time. Time spent in appropriate leisure, reading, improving books, taking healthful walks, engaging in cultured conversation was acceptable time. Time spent idle, unproductive, without clear purpose was dangerous time, tempting time, when moral decay could set in. So every moment of your day, even the moment spent simply moving from one place to another, had to be justified, explained, demonstrated to be proper use of temporal resources. There's a profound sadness to this, isn't there? The inability to just be, to just walk without calculating the optimal speed, to just stop and look at something without worrying about loitering, to just talk to a friend without timing the conversation. The Victorians had effectively weaponized time against themselves. They'd created a system where the clock wasn't just a tool for coordination, but a constant judge of your worth, your status, your very right to exist in public space. And here's the thing that really gets me. They thought this was progress. They thought this was civilization. They contrasted their precisely timed, rigidly structured public behavior with what they imagined were the chaotic, undisciplined public spaces of earlier eras or other cultures. They wrote about how time discipline had elevated society, how it had made cities more orderly, how it had distinguished the civilized from the savage. The ability to regulate your behavior down to the second was seen as the pinnacle of human development. But what they'd actually created was a society where people were afraid to be spontaneous, afraid to be present in the moment, afraid to let their guard down even for a minute in public because someone might be watching, judging, calculating whether you were using your time appropriately. The street became another battlefield in the Victorian war against wasted time, and like all the other battlefields we've explored, the dinner table, the factory floor, the social call, it was a war that nobody could win, because there was no perfection to achieve, only an endless series of temporal hurdles to clear, each one leading to another forever. But the Victorians weren't content to regulate just the hours you were awake and active. They believed that even your rest, even your leisure time, even the moments when you weren't working or socializing needed to be optimized, scheduled, made productive in some way. Because if wasting working hours was a sin, then wasting leisure hours was perhaps even worse. It suggested that you lacked the moral fiber to improve yourself, even when you had the freedom to do so. And this led to one of the most peculiar Victorian contradictions, where the time you weren't supposed to be working became another form of work, where relaxation became a duty, where rest became just another opportunity to be judged for your temporal choices. It's Wednesday evening in 1885 and you've just finished your workday. You have 3 precious hours before you need to sleep in preparation for tomorrow's obligations. 3 whole hours that belong to you that you can spend however you wish. Freedom, right? Rest. Relaxation, the chance to finally do nothing not in Victorian Britain. Because here's the cruel paradox at the heart of Victorian time obsession. The Victorians preached endlessly about the importance of leisure, about balance, about not overworking yourself. But they couldn't let leisure just be leisure. They had to make it productive. They had to optimize it. They had to turn your free time into yet another opportunity to improve yourself, to build character, to prove your worth. Rest became work. Relaxation became duty. And suddenly those 3 free hours felt like another shift at a different kind of factory. Let me introduce you to a concept that dominated Victorian leisure time: rational recreation. This was the idea that your leisure activities should be purposeful, educational, morally improving. You shouldn't just enjoy yourself, you should enjoy yourself in ways that made you a better person. So reading was acceptable leisure, but only if you were reading the right things. Novels were suspect. They filled your head with fanciful nonsense and wasted time you could spend on improving literature. Self-help books, religious texts, scientific treatises, histories, these were appropriate. They educated while they entertained, or better yet, they educated without entertaining too much. The Victorian bestseller lists were dominated by books with titles like Self-Help, Character, Thrift, Duty. These weren't page-turners in the modern sense. They were moral instruction manuals dressed up as leisure reading. People would spend their precious free time reading books that told them they weren't using their free time properly. The irony is delicious and depressing in equal measure. But it went beyond reading. Every hobby, every pastime, every leisure activity had to justify itself through usefulness. Take collecting, which became hugely popular in Victorian times, but you couldn't just collect things because you enjoyed them. Your collection had to be educational. Butterfly collecting excellent, you're learning about natural history. Stamp collecting wonderful, you're learning geography and politics. Collecting beautiful rocks just because they're pretty frivolous, wasteful, lacking in purpose. Victorian ladies were encouraged to fill their leisure hours with accomplishments, playing the piano, watercolour, painting, embroidery, learning French or Italian. But notice these weren't just hobbies. They were skills that demonstrated refinement that could be displayed to potential suitors or impressed guests. Even leisure had to have a purpose beyond enjoyment, and these accomplishments were scheduled. Victorian young women would have designated times for piano practice 30 minutes in the morning, perhaps another 30 in the evening. Designated times for drawing instruction. Designated times for language study. Their free time was as regimented as their social obligations. There are heartbreaking diary entries from Victorian girls who write things like, "Failed to complete my piano practice today due to fatigue. I am weak-willed and must do better." Imagine feeling guilty about not practicing piano during your leisure time because you were too tired from all your other obligations. The concept of doing absolutely nothing was anathema to Victorians. Sitting quietly, daydreaming, letting your mind wander, these were seen as dangerous wastes of time that could lead to moral decay. The Victorian advice literature is full of warnings about idleness being the devil's workshop, about how an idle mind is vulnerable to all sorts of temptations and corruptions. So Victorians filled every moment with activity even in their leisure hours, and they created elaborate systems to track whether they were using their leisure productively. Remember those pre-printed diaries we talked about? Many of them had sections specifically for tracking self-improvement activities. How many pages did you read today? How many minutes of exercise? How much time spent in prayer or meditation? How much time devoted to learning new skills? Your leisure time became another set of metrics to obsess over, another source of guilt when you inevitably failed to optimize every minute. Here's a specific example that shows how far this went. There was a Victorian movement called the Improvement Society, or Mutual Improvement Society. Groups of middle-class people would gather regularly, usually weekly, to engage in structured self-improvement activities. They would give presentations to each other, debate improving topics, quiz each other on knowledge they'd gained. It was like turning leisure time into an unpaid educational seminar, and people did this voluntarily. They would spend their one evening off from work sitting through amateur lectures on agricultural improvements or the political economy of trade relations. Why? Because the idea of spending that evening just relaxing, just enjoying conversation without educational purpose, just being together without structure or agenda felt wrong. It felt like wasting time. It felt like failing to take advantage of opportunities for growth. The pressure to constantly improve, to constantly be productive, to constantly justify your use of time extended even to physical rest. Sleep itself became subject to Victorian optimization. There was this whole literature about how many hours of sleep were morally appropriate. Too much sleep was lazy, self-indulgent evidence of weak character. too little sleep was foolish, risking your health and thus your productivity. You needed the right amount, typically 7 to 8 hours, and you needed sleep at the right times. Early to bed, early to rise, this wasn't just practical advice, it was moral instruction. Benjamin Franklin's famous quote was everywhere in Victorian culture. Early to bed and early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. The implication being that if you slept late, you would be unhealthy, poor, and foolish. So even your sleep schedule became a moral statement. Waking at 5 or 6 in the morning demonstrated virtue and discipline. Waking at 8 or 9 suggested you were lazy, undisciplined, probably not going anywhere in life. Never mind that some people are naturally night owls. Never mind that industrial workers on night shifts couldn't possibly maintain this schedule. Never mind that human biology varies and different people need different amounts of rest. The Victorians had decided on the morally correct sleep pattern, and deviation from it reflected poorly on your character. There are accounts of Victorian parents deliberately waking their children early even when there was no particular reason to wake them, just to instill the habit of early rising. Sleep was training ground for time discipline. But the optimization of leisure time reached perhaps its most absurd extreme in the Victorian approach to walking for exercise. Taking walks became hugely popular in Victorian times, partly for health reasons and partly because it was one of the few acceptable forms of recreation that didn't cost money. But of course the Victorians couldn't just take casual, pleasant walks, they had to make it systematic. There was entire literature on the proper duration of walks, the proper pace, the proper time of day, the proper routes, the proper posture while walking. Some Victorian health reformers advocated for constitutional walks of exactly 1 hour taken at exactly the same time each day at exactly the same brisk pace. The walk wasn't about enjoying nature or clearing your head. It was about methodically improving your health through precisely measured physical activity. It's like an early version of fitness tracking, except instead of a Fitbit, you had a pocket watch and a rigid sense of duty. And heaven forbid you just wandered, just meandered, just let your feet take you wherever they wanted to go. That would be aimless, purposeless, a waste of walking time. Your walk needed to have a route, a schedule, a clear beginning and end. I came across this wonderful quote from a Victorian walking enthusiast who wrote, "A walk without purpose is like a day without tasks, a lost opportunity for improvement of both body and soul." Can you imagine even taking a walk had to have a purpose beyond the walk itself? The same obsession with productive leisure extended to Victorian weekends. Saturday afternoon and Sunday were supposed to be rest days, at least for the middle and upper classes, but that rest couldn't be idle. Sundays especially were for church, for religious reading, for quiet contemplation of moral and spiritual matters. Doing anything too entertaining on a Sunday was suspect. Playing cards, scandalous. Going to the theatre, absolutely not. Even reading secular novels on Sunday could earn you disapproving looks and whispered criticism, so your day of rest became another day of structured, purposeful activity, just focused on spiritual improvement rather than economic productivity. You were still optimizing, still improving, still using time productively, just in a different domain. Here's what I find most tragic about all this. The Victorians had unprecedented leisure time compared to previous generations. The middle class especially had evenings free, had Sundays off, had the resources to pursue hobbies and interests. They had real opportunities for rest, for joy, for connection with family and friends. But they were so trapped in the cult of productivity, so convinced that every minute had to be justified, that they couldn't simply enjoy these opportunities. They turned leisure into another form of labour. They made relaxation stressful. They transformed free time into yet another arena for guilt and failure. And the result, Victorian diaries and letters, are full of people feeling exhausted, burned out, overwhelmed. Not because they were working too hard at their jobs, though many were, but because they were also working hard at leisure, at self-improvement, at the constant project of becoming better people through optimal use of every available minute. One Victorian woman wrote in her diary, "Today, I had 4 hours free from obligations. I read for 1 hour, practiced piano for 1 hour, took a constitutional walk for 1 hour, and spent the final hour on correspondence. Yet I feel I accomplished nothing. The hours slipped away, and I am no better for having spent them." 4 hours of productive activity, and she feels like she wasted the time. That's the Victorian leisure paradox in one devastating paragraph. Do you see the pattern we've been tracing through all these sections? The Victorians took time, this neutral natural phenomenon, and turned it into a weapon they used against themselves. They convinced themselves that every minute had to be optimized, every hour had to be justified, every day had to be measured and found either adequate or wanting. And they did this in every domain of life. Work time, social time, public time, private time, even leisure time. There was no escape from the clock, no refuge from the ticking, no moment when you could stop calculating and just be. But all of this temporal obsession, all these elaborate rules and systems and anxieties, they didn't emerge from nowhere. They were created, systematized, and disseminated through specific institutions and technologies. And perhaps no technology was more important to Victorian time discipline than the synchronized clock itself. Not just the device, but the entire network of clocks connected by telegraph wires, all pulsing to the same astronomical heartbeat from Greenwich, creating what one Victorian writer called a web of electrical time that entangled the entire nation. And understanding how this network was built, how it worked, and why the Victorians invested so much in creating it will reveal the final piece of this strange temporal puzzle. Deep inside the Royal Observatory at Greenwich, there's a clock that doesn't just tell time, it defines time. Every day at precisely 1 o'clock in the afternoon, this astronomical masterpiece sends an electrical pulse through telegraph wires that spread across Britain like nerve fibres in a vast temporal organism. The pulse reaches railway stations, post offices, town halls, churches, and in each of these locations clocks twitch in response, adjusting themselves to match the heartbeat from Greenwich. By the 1870s, this synchronized network had become so sophisticated, so all-encompassing, that a historian described it as time itself becoming a circulating fluid of modern urban life, invisible, essential, flowing through cities the way water flows through pipes or blood flows through veins. The Victorians had done something unprecedented in human history. They had taken time, this abstract philosophical concept, and turned it into infrastructure, physical infrastructure. You could see it in the massive public clocks that dominated railway stations and town squares. You could hear it in the telegraph signals that clicked through the wires. You could feel it in the way entire populations moved in synchronized rhythms, all dancing to the same distant drumbeat from Greenwich. But why? Why did the Victorians invest so much money, so much engineering genius, so much social capital into creating this temporal network? What were they really trying to achieve? The official answer was coordination. Railways needed synchronized clocks to prevent collisions. Businesses needed standardized time to conduct transactions across distances. The military needed precise timing for coordination. All of this is true practical rationale. But there was something deeper happening, something almost mystical about the Victorian relationship with synchronized time. Scientists and engineers of the era genuinely believed that synchronized clocks were civilizing society, not just organizing it, civilizing it, making people better, elevating humanity. There's this remarkable quote from the director of the Harvard College Observatory in 1853. He was boasting about their time signal service, and he said, "The beats of our clock can in effect be instantly made audible at any telegraph station within several hundred miles of this observatory." think about the language. The beats of our clock. Not the time or the signal one, but the actual beats, the pulse, the heartbeat. He's describing the clock as if it's alive, as if its rhythm is something organic that can be transmitted, shared, experienced across vast distances, and he's proud of this, thrilled by it. Because what they'd achieved was genuinely miraculous by the standards of the time. For all of human history until this moment, time had been local, individual, impossible to share precisely across distance. But now with telegraph wires and electrical signals, the tick of a single clock in Greenwich could be heard, felt, experienced by thousands of people simultaneously across hundreds of miles. It was like creating a shared heartbeat for an entire civilization. The Victorians understood this was revolutionary. They wrote about it in almost religious terms. Synchronized time was described as binding society together, creating unity where there had been chaos, bringing order to what had been disorder. One Victorian engineer wrote that the electrical coordination of clocks meant that all of civilized society now breathes together, works together, exists together in the same temporal moment. There's poetry in that statement, but also something slightly unsettling, because what he's describing is conformity, uniformity, everyone moving in lockstep to the same temporal rhythm, and the Victorians loved it. They saw synchronized time as proof of progress, of modernity, of humanity's mastery over nature. They'd taken something as fundamental as the passage of time and made it subject to human control and design. The clock network itself was a marvel of Victorian engineering. By the 1860s and 70s, synchronized time had extended into neighborhoods, into individual streets. Public clocks were everywhere, in train stations, of course, but also in post offices, police stations, schools, hospitals, markets, anywhere people gathered. These weren't just timepieces, they were visible symbols of the new temporal order, and the Victorians made them deliberately almost imposing. The clocks were huge, ornate, impossible to ignore. They dominated the visual landscape the way church steeples had once dominated medieval towns. And that's not a coincidental comparison, because in many ways the synchronized clock network was replacing the church as the authority on time. For centuries, church bells had told people when to wake, when to pray, when to work, when to rest. Time was ecclesiastical, connected to the liturgical calendar and the rhythm of religious observance. But the Victorian clock network transferred that authority from God to science, from church to observatory, from faith to measurement. Time became secular, mechanical, precise. Some people resisted this. There are records of small towns that refused to abandon their church-based time even when the railway came through. They would have 2 clocks in the town square, one showing traditional local time based on the church bells, one showing railway time based on Greenwich. The resistance was about more than convenience. It was about what time meant, where its authority came from, but gradually, inexorably, the synchronized clock network won. By 1880, Greenwich Mean Time became Britain's legal standard time. The battle was over. The clocks had conquered. And once the infrastructure was in place, once everyone was synchronized, the Victorians discovered they could use time as a tool of social control in ways that had never been possible before. Because here's the thing about synchronized time, it makes everyone's behavior visible and comparable. If we're all using different clocks, I can't really judge whether you're late or not. Your clock might say you're on time. Mine might say you're late. We negotiate reality. But if we're all synchronized to Greenwich, if we all hear the same 1 o'clock signal, then there's no negotiation. There's just fact. You were late or you weren't. You were efficient or you weren't. Your use of time was good or bad, productive or wasteful, morally sound or morally deficient. Synchronized time created a universal standard for judgment, and the Victorians used it ruthlessly. Schools started using synchronized clocks to enforce discipline. When the school bell rang at exactly 9 o'clock, every student was expected to be in their seat. No excuses, no variations. The clock said 9, you should be there. Factories had already been using time discipline, but synchronized clocks made it even more precise and even more punitive. Now employers could prove definitively that you were 37 seconds late, not just approximately late. The precision enabled micro-level punishment. Even in private homes, synchronized time changed behavior. Families would set their schedules by the public clocks they could see or hear from their windows. Dinner would be served when the town hall clock struck 6. Children would be sent to bed when the church clock chimed 8. The public clock became a kind of external authority figure dictating the rhythm of private life. And here's something I find particularly fascinating. The Victorians started to trust synchronized clocks more than they trusted their own senses, their own experience. If your body told you it was time to rest, but the clock said you had 2 more hours of work, you ignored your body and trusted the clock. If you felt like you had been walking for 20 minutes, but the clock said it had only been 10, you questioned your own perception, not the clock's accuracy. The clock became more real than reality, more authoritative than your own lived experience. This is the power of infrastructure, right? Once it's in place, once it's so ubiquitous that you can't remember life without it, it doesn't just reflect reality, it creates reality. It tells you what's true. And the Victorians built this infrastructure with such thoroughness, such precision, such determination that they fundamentally altered human consciousness. They created a world where clock time wasn't just one way of measuring the day, it was the only legitimate way. There's a quote I mentioned earlier, it's worth revisiting. The American railway administrator William Allen claimed that if a city were cut off from railway and telegraph communication for just 1 month, and if all the clocks were secretly adjusted by 30 minutes, not one person in 1,000 would notice. This wasn't just speculation. He was making a profound observation about dependency. The Victorians had become so reliant on the synchronized clock network that without it they would lose their grip on time entirely. They'd forgotten how to tell time by the sun, by the stars, by natural rhythms. They'd outsourced that knowledge to the infrastructure. And once you've outsourced something that fundamental, you're vulnerable. You're dependent. You're controlled. The synchronized clock network was celebrated as liberation freedom from the chaos of multiple local times, freedom from the uncertainty of imprecise timekeeping. But it was also constraint, because now you couldn't define time for yourself, you couldn't negotiate, you had to accept the time that Greenwich told you it was, and you had to organize your entire life around it. Something both beautiful and terrifying about the scale of this transformation. Beautiful because it represents extraordinary human ingenuity and cooperation, the ability to coordinate millions of people across thousands of miles through technology. Terrifying because it represents the surrender of individual autonomy to a system that treats all humans as interchangeable units that need to be synchronized. The Victorians themselves seem to sense both aspects. Their writings about synchronized time are filled with wonder and pride, but also occasionally with unease. Some diarists wrote about feeling controlled by the clock, enslaved to its rhythm, unable to escape its demands even in their own thoughts. One Victorian writer compared the synchronized clock network to a spider's web with Greenwich at the centre and telegraph wires spreading out like silk strands, trapping everyone in the same temporal structure. It's a striking metaphor, both beautiful and predatory, and the web kept expanding. By the late Victorian era, synchronized time had spread beyond Britain to cover much of the industrialized world. The International Meridian Conference of 1884 established Greenwich as the prime meridian, dividing the entire planet into 24 time zones, all synchronized to that one location in England. The whole world, from Tokyo to New York to Sydney, now organised its days around a clock in London. British imperial power made literal the empire didn't just control territory, it controlled time itself. And this raises an uncomfortable question that some Victorian critics began to ask. What gives Greenwich the right to define time for the entire planet? What makes their clock more authoritative than anyone else's? The answer, of course, was power. Britain had the most extensive railway network, the most sophisticated telegraph system, the most dominant navy, the largest empire. So Britain got to decide what time it was. Time became colonised just like everything else the British touched. But setting aside the imperial implications, the synchronised clock network achieved something the Victorians desperately wanted. It created the illusion of control, of mastery, of precision. In a rapidly changing world where industrialization was disrupting every aspect of life, where cities were growing chaotically, where old social structures were crumbling, the synchronized clock provided something stable, something predictable, something everyone could agree on. No matter how much else was uncertain, you knew that when the clock struck noon, it was noon everywhere. That shared truth felt like an anchor in a storm. And so the Victorians clung to their clocks, their synchronized networks, their temporal precision. They built bigger clocks, more accurate clocks, more beautiful clocks. They extended the telegraph wires further, synchronized more precisely, brought more people into the temporal web. They turned time itself into a monument to Victorian ingenuity and Victorian values. And in doing so, they trapped themselves in a system they could no longer escape a rhythm, they could no longer change a temporal prison they'd built with their own hands. But after all this, after all the synchronized clocks and rigid schedules and moral judgments and temporal anxiety, what did it all mean? What did the Victorians really accomplish with their obsession with time? And perhaps more importantly, what did they leave behind for us? Because here we are, more than a century later, still living with the consequences of Victorian time discipline, still following rules they invented, still feeling guilt they created. So in these final moments together, let's step back and look at the whole strange picture, at what this journey through Victorian temporal madness can teach us about our own relationship with time, about what we've inherited and about what we might finally be ready to let go. Pull out your phone for a moment. Go ahead, I'll wait. Now look at your screen time report for this week. Look at the apps that track your productivity, your steps, your sleep quality, your water intake, your meditation minutes. Look at your calendar with its color-coded time blocks and its reminders pinging you throughout the day. Look at the guilt you feel when you see that you spent 3 hours on social media yesterday when you meant to spend that time being productive. Now, ask yourself, is this really any different from a Victorian diary filled with apologies for wasted time? Is your Fitbit really that different from a Victorian pocket watch used to measure the moral value of your day? Are we really any less obsessed with optimizing every minute than the Victorians were? Here's the uncomfortable truth we need to face. We like to think we've evolved beyond Victorian rigidity, that we're more enlightened, more balanced, more understanding of human needs. But in reality, we've just digitized Victorian time discipline. We've taken their obsessions and made them portable, constant, inescapable. The Victorians had to consciously check their pocket watches to feel guilty about time. We have devices that buzz in our pockets every few minutes to remind us we're not being productive enough. The Victorians had to physically write in their diaries to track their failures. We have apps that automatically generate reports on how we've wasted our days. We've made Victorian time anxiety frictionless, effortless, always on. And here's what's both fascinating and deeply sad about this. Almost every single anxiety we feel about time can be traced directly back to Victorian innovations. Let me show you the connections. You feel guilty about being late. That's Victorian punctuality culture, which transformed tardiness from a minor social inconvenience into a moral failing that revealed your fundamental character. You feel like you're wasting your life if you're not constantly productive. That's the Victorian belief that idle time is sinful time, that every moment must be justified through usefulness. You track your habits and feel bad when you don't meet your self-imposed targets. That's the Victorian self-improvement culture that turned leisure into work and rest into another opportunity for failure. You believe that successful people wake up early and that sleeping late is lazy. That's Victorian moral judgments about sleep schedules dressed up as productivity advice. You feel anxious about how you spend your free time, like you should be learning something or improving yourself rather than just relaxing. That's the Victorian concept of rational recreation, which couldn't let leisure just be leisure. Every single one of these feelings, these beliefs, these anxieties, they're not natural. They're not universal human experiences. They're Victorian inventions that we've inherited and internalized so completely that we think they're just how things are. But they're not. They're choices. Choices made by a specific culture at a specific time for specific reasons. And here's the thing about choices, they can be unmade. Let me tell you what the Victorians actually accomplished with all their time obsession. On the positive side, and there were positive outcomes, they created systems of coordination that made modern life possible. Synchronized time allowed for complex transportation networks, international commerce, scientific collaboration across distances. The ability to say, let's meet at 3 o'clock, and have everyone know exactly when that is revolutionized human cooperation. They also created a culture of reliability and follow-through that had real benefits. When people say they'll do something, there's an expectation they'll actually do it. That's not nothing. That's valuable social glue. And the Victorian emphasis on self-improvement, for all its excesses, did encourage education literacy, personal development. The idea that anyone could better themselves through effort and learning was democratizing in important ways. So I'm not saying everything about Victorian time culture was bad, but let's look at the costs. Let's really look at them. The Victorians created a culture of perpetual anxiety where people were never good enough, never productive enough, never disciplined enough. They made rest feel like failure and relaxation feel like sin. They turned the natural variations in human energy and attention into character defects. They built systems that enriched factory owners while punishing workers for being human. They created social hierarchies based on who could best perform temporal propriety rather than on actual merit or contribution. They made time into a weapon used primarily by the powerful against the powerless. The upper classes could be fashionably late because they had the power to make others wait. The working classes had to be precisely punctual or lose their livelihoods. And perhaps most damaging, they severed humanity's connection to natural rhythms, to seasons, to daylight, the body's own sense of time. They replaced intuitive organic time with mechanical measured time, and in doing so they made us strangers to our own biology. The Victorian time legacy is deeply mixed, and we've inherited all of it, the useful coordination and the toxic guilt, the productive discipline, and the destructive anxiety, the social progress and the class oppression. But here's where it gets really interesting. Despite inheriting all of this, we're not doomed to keep it. Because once you see that these beliefs about time are cultural constructs rather than natural laws, you can start to question them. You can start to choose differently. Let me give you some examples of how we might do this, how we might keep what's useful from Victorian time discipline while letting go of what's destructive. We can value punctuality for important commitments without believing that being 5 minutes late reveals fundamental character flaws. We can say, "I'm sorry I'm late," without spiraling into existential guilt about our worth as humans. We can appreciate productivity without believing that our value as people is measured by our output. We can have productive days and unproductive days and understand that both are part of being human. We can pursue self-improvement without turning every leisure moment into another opportunity for optimization. We can read a novel just because it's enjoyable. We can take a walk without it being a constitutional. We can waste time without feeling wretched about it. We can use our devices to coordinate and communicate without letting them become instruments of constant self-surveillance and judgment. We can turn off the tracking, ignore the metrics, delete the apps that make us feel bad about being human. Here's something I find really hopeful. There are signs that people are starting to reject Victorian time discipline, even if they don't realize that's what they're rejecting. The rise of movements around work-life balance, around rest as resistance, around slowing down. These are all rebellions against Victorian temporal values. When someone says, "I'm not going to check email after 6, they're rejecting the Victorian belief that every moment should be available for productive use. When someone says, "I'm taking a mental health day," they're rejecting the Victorian idea that you power through fatigue and discomfort because discipline matters more than well-being. When someone says, "I'm just going to sit and do nothing for a while," they're doing something the Victorians would have found incomprehensible and morally questionable. And that's beautiful, because doing nothing, real nothing, not productive rest or rational recreation or self-improvement disguised as leisure doing nothing is revolutionary. It's a rejection of the entire Victorian time system. It's saying, my worth as a human being is not determined by how I use my time. Now, I'm not suggesting we should all become completely unstructured and abandon all time discipline. Coordination is useful. Keeping commitments matters. Planning has value. The Victorian era did give us some tools that genuinely improve life. But we can use those tools without being enslaved by them. We can appreciate what synchronized time makes possible without believing that every minute must be optimized. We can have schedules without having our entire existence reduced to scheduled productivity. The key is consciousness. Awareness, recognizing that the voice in your head that says you're wasting time isn't your voice. It's an echo of Victorian moral panic from 150 years ago. And once you recognize it, you can thank it for its concern and then ignore it. You can make different choices. You can define success differently. You can measure your life by different metrics. You can ask, was I present instead of was I productive? You can ask, did I enjoy this instead of was this useful? These are radical questions in a culture still dominated by Victorian time values, but they're important questions, essential questions, because here's what the Victorians got wrong, fundamentally wrong at the core of all their time obsession. They believed that time was something to be conquered, controlled, optimized, extracted of maximum value. They saw time as a resource to be mined, a commodity to be traded, a measure of worth. But time isn't any of those things. Time is the medium in which we live. It's not separate from life, it is life. And you can't optimize life. You can only experience it. The Victorians were so busy measuring and tracking and judging their use of time that many of them forgot to actually live in time. They turned existence into a performance with the clock as both script and critic, and we're doing the same thing. How many of us have had the experience of being somewhere beautiful, doing something enjoyable but unable to fully be present because we're thinking about all the things we should be doing instead? Or because we're documenting it for social media rather than experiencing it? Or because we're calculating whether this is a good use of our limited time? That's the Victorian legacy. That's what they did to us. They taught us to be spectators of our own lives, constantly judging, never quite inhabiting the moment. But it doesn't have to be this way. What if we could keep the useful parts of Victorian time discipline, the coordination, the reliability, the planning, while letting go of the guilt, the anxiety, the constant judgment? What if we could be punctual without being anxious, productive without being compulsive, organized without being oppressed? What if we could reclaim time from the tyranny of the clock? This isn't a fantasy. this is possible. It requires consciousness intention practice. It requires recognizing Victorian beliefs about time when they arise in your thoughts and actively choosing different beliefs. It requires building new habits to replace the old ones. It requires fundamentally giving yourself permission to be human, to rest when you're tired, to play without purpose and to waste time without guilt, to exist without justification. The Victorians would be horrified by this suggestion. They would see it as moral decay, as the collapse of civilization, as humanity sliding backward into chaos. But maybe what looks like chaos to Victorian eyes is actually just being alive. Maybe what they called discipline was actually just fear. Fear of uncertainty, fear of losing control, fear that without constant vigilance they would reveal themselves as inadequate. And maybe we've inherited that fear along with everything else. Maybe that's why we track and measure and optimize and feel guilty. Because we're afraid that if we stop, if we just let ourselves be, we'll be revealed as somehow not enough. But here's the truth they couldn't see, and we're only beginning to understand. You are enough. Right now, as you are, without optimization, without perfect time management, without constant productivity. You're enough. The ticking clock doesn't determine your worth. The calendar doesn't define your value. The number of productive hours in your day doesn't measure your humanity. You're more than your time use. You're more than your productivity. You are more than your schedule. And recognizing that, really recognizing it, feeling it, living, it is how we finally break free from the Victorian trap. That's how we honor what was useful in their innovations while releasing what was destructive. That's how we move forward. So as we approach the end of this journey through Victorian time obsession, as we prepare to step back into our own relationship with time, I want you to hold on to this one thought. The Victorians invented most of our anxiety about time, but inventions can be uninvented. Beliefs can be changed. The cage they built can be opened. All it takes is recognizing that the cage was never locked. We've just been afraid to test the door. And maybe it's finally time to step outside to experience time on our own terms, to discover what life feels like when we stop judging every minute and start simply living in them. Let me tell you about something that happened in the late Victorian era that I think is both hilarious and profoundly revealing. In the 1890s, there was a brief but passionate movement among some British intellectuals to abolish clock time entirely. Not just reform it, abolish it. They wanted to return to what they called natural time, where people would wake with the sun, eat, when hungry sleep, when tired, and organize their days around intuition and natural rhythms rather than mechanical measurement. The movement failed, obviously. By that point, synchronized time was too deeply embedded in the infrastructure, the economy, the very fabric of society. You couldn't just opt out. The trains ran on schedules, the factories operated on shifts, the entire social order depended on everyone being synchronized. But the fact that this movement existed at all tells you something important. Even at the height of Victorian time discipline, even when the clock network was at its most sophisticated and all-encompassing, there were people who recognized that something had been lost. That in gaining precision and coordination, humanity had surrendered something precious and irreplaceable. They were right, of course. We did lose something. We lost the ability to trust our own bodies, our own sense of time, our own judgment about when we need rest or activity or nourishment. We traded that internal wisdom for external authority, the authority of the clock. And here's the thing, we can't go back. We can't uninvent synchronized time. We can't dismantle the railway schedules or ignore the coordinated meetings or pretend that clock time doesn't exist. The infrastructure is too vast, too essential to modern life. But we can change our relationship with it. We can stop letting the clock be our master and make it our tool instead. We can use time management when it's helpful and ignore it when it's harmful. We come in the world of clocks without being of it. Let me give you a concrete example of what this might look like. Imagine you've had a long, exhausting week. It's Friday evening. You have Saturday free, no obligations, no schedule, nothing you have to do. The Victorian approach, the approach we've inherited, would be to plan your Saturday. Make it productive. Accomplish tasks. Improve yourself. Use the time wisely. But what if you didn't? What if you woke up Saturday morning and just saw what happened? Ate when you were hungry. Moved when you felt restless. Rested when you were tired. Let the day unfold without a schedule, without judgment, without that voice in your head, calculating whether each moment was a good use of time. That's not laziness. That's not wasting time. That's actually a very sophisticated act of rebellion against Victorian time discipline. It's saying, I'm going to trust my own experience more than I trust the clock's authority. Now, I'm not suggesting you can or should do this every day. We live in a world that requires coordination. You have work obligations, appointments with other people, commitments that matter. But having one day, one afternoon, even 1 hour where you completely disconnect from clock time and just exist, that's powerful. That's reclaiming something the Victorians took from us. And it's harder than it sounds. Try it sometime. Try spending even 1 hour without checking the time, without calculating how long you've been doing something, without wondering if you should be doing something else. Your mind will rebel. You'll feel anxious. That's Victorian conditioning, and it runs deep. But if you can push through that initial discomfort, something interesting happens. You start to notice things you normally miss because you're too busy tracking time. You start to actually experience moments instead of just moving through them on your way to the next scheduled thing. You start to remember what it feels like to just be. And that experience, that recovery of presence, of being fully in time, rather than constantly measuring it, that's the antidote to Victorian time anxiety. Here's what I've come to believe after diving deep into Victorian time obsession. The Victorians were brilliant engineers and terrible philosophers. They figured out how to coordinate millions of people across vast distances, how to make trains run on time, how to build networks of synchronized clocks that still function today. But they made a philosophical error that still haunts us. They confused precision with truth. They thought that because they could measure time precisely, they understood what time was. They thought that because they could divide the day into exact minutes and seconds, they had mastered time itself. But measuring something isn't the same as understanding it. And controlling something isn't the same as mastering it. The Victorians could control clock time, but they didn't understand lived time, the way a moment can feel eternal, or how an hour can disappear, the way time moves differently when you're in pain versus when you're in love, the way your experience of time is completely subjective and unmeasurable and profoundly real. They tried to make time objective, universal, identical for everyone. But time isn't like that. Time is personal. Time is experienced. And the attempt to force everyone into the same temporal framework created the anxiety we have been exploring throughout this entire journey. So what do we do with this knowledge? How do we live in the world the Victorians created without being destroyed by the anxieties they embedded in it? I think it starts with forgiveness. Forgiving ourselves for being late sometimes, for wasting time sometimes, for not being productive every minute, for being human in a world designed for machines. The Victorian voice in your head that says you're failing, that you're not enough, that you're wasting your potential, that voice is wrong. It was always wrong. It was wrong in 1885 and it's wrong now. You don't have to be perfectly punctual to be a good person. You don't have to optimize every hour to have a valuable life. You don't have to track and measure and improve constantly to deserve existence. You can just be. And that's enough. It's more than enough. It's everything. I want to share one final Victorian story with you. There was a woman named Emily Shaw who lived in the 1830s and 40s. She kept a detailed diary and she was obsessed with self-improvement, with using time productively, with all the Victorian virtues we've been discussing. But Emily Shaw died young at age 19 from tuberculosis. And in the final entries of her diary, knowing she was dying, she wrote something that breaks my heart and heals it at the same time. She wrote, "I have spent so much of my life preparing to live, and now I see that the preparation was the living. I was already living all along, and I didn't know it." She spent her short life feeling guilty about wasted time, about moments that weren't productive enough, about days that didn't meet her standards, and only at the very end did she realize that all of it, the productive days and the wasted ones, the disciplined moments and the lazy ones, all of it was her life. It was all living. And by judging it, by measuring it, by constantly finding it inadequate, she'd been missing it. Don't make Emily Shaw's mistake. Don't spend your life preparing to live. You're already living, right now, this moment, the one where you're listening to a story about Victorian time obsession while lying in bed, or driving in your car, or doing the dishes, or wherever you are. This moment is your life, not a preparation for life, not a waste of time that should be spent on something more important. This is it. This is the life you have. And yes, there will be moments when you need to be punctual, when schedules matter, when coordination is important. Use the Victorian tools for that. Be on time for the things that matter. Keep your commitments. Plan when planning is helpful, but don't let the tools use you. Don't let Victorian anxiety about time steal your experience of actually being alive. Don't let the clock become your judge, your master, your tyrant. Because here's the beautiful, liberating truth that the Victorians never quite grasped. Time isn't something you can waste or save or invest. You can't put minutes in a bank and withdraw them later. You can't make time, you can't find time, you can't manage time. Time just is. It passes at exactly the same rate whether you're productive or lazy, disciplined or chaotic, optimized or messy. What you can do is choose how you experience the time you have. And that choice, that fundamental choice about whether you'll experience time as a gift or a burden, as freedom or oppression, as opportunity or obligation, that's the only choice that matters. The Victorians chose burden, oppression, obligation. They built elaborate systems to enforce that choice, and we inherited those systems along with the burden they create. But we don't have to keep choosing the same way. We can choose differently. We can choose presence over productivity. We can choose experience over optimization. We can choose being over doing. And that choice made moment by moment, day by day, is how we finally free ourselves from the Victorian trap. That's how we honor what was useful in their innovations while releasing what was destructive. That's how we move forward. So as you go about your day, as you check your watch or your phone or your calendar, as you feel that familiar anxiety about whether you're using your time well, pause for just a second. Notice that feeling. Recognize it as a Victorian ghost, an echo from another century, a voice that isn't yours, and then gently, kindly set it aside. Come back to this moment, this actual present, irreplaceable moment, and just be in it, without judgment, without measurement, without the need to justify or optimize or improve. Just be. That's the gift the Victorians couldn't give themselves. But it's a gift we can give ourselves every day, every moment. The clock on the wall will keep ticking, the schedule will keep demanding, the voice of Victorian time discipline will keep whispering that you should be doing more, being better, using every minute more efficiently. But underneath all of that noise there's a quieter truth. You're already enough. This moment is already enough. Life is already happening right now, and you don't need permission from any clock to experience it fully. Thank you for taking this journey with me through the strange, obsessive, anxious world of Victorian time beliefs. Thank you for listening to these stories about pocket watches and railway schedules and guilt-filled diaries. Thank you for spending these hours with me exploring how a society became so obsessed with time that they nearly forgot how to live. I hope this story has given you something useful, maybe some historical context for your own time anxiety, maybe some permission to let go of the guilt, maybe just the comfort of knowing that these feelings aren't your fault, they're inherited, learned, cultural. And what's learned can be unlearned. Until our next strange history adventure, I wish you presence. I wish you moments where you forget to check the clock. I wish you hours that feel timeless. I wish you the courage to waste time without guilt and the wisdom to know that no moment spent being fully alive is ever wasted. Sleep well, dream softly, and remember the clock doesn't own you. You own your time, you always have. Good night.